Hey everyone, my name is Ryan, and in this video, I'm going to give you guys an in-depth editing walkthrough of this image. So I'm going to start with Photoshop, cutting my subject out from the background and prepping it for 3D, and then I'm going to go over my process inside of Blender where I show how I can construct a 3D environment for my image, and then I'm going to finish things back up again inside of Photoshop where I combine the 3D elements with the photography into one cohesive image. So this video is going to be a little less structured, a little less formal than my usual editing breakdowns. I'm not going to really speed through anything. There's not going to be any time lapses, or at least mostly not any time lapses. And I'm going to kind of go through my thought process as I edit the photo. So there's going to be a lot of mistakes. There's going to be a lot of me just not knowing what I'm talking about and rambling on. But this is something that you guys have been asking for. So hopefully this is helpful. Hopefully this is something that you want more of. By the way, real quick guys, if you want to follow along with me and copy what I'm doing step by step, I will have a link to the project file, the Photoshop and the blend file and the original image in the description below. So you can go ahead and just download that for free and follow along. And yeah. Okay, so first thing I like to do is, since I'm not doing any skin retouching, is I'm going to cut my subject out from the background. So first things first, inside of Photoshop, I like to go over, click on the quick selection tool over here on the left side, and then I get a select subject. And what that usually does is it gives me a good starting point for my mask, for my subject. So as you can see, it's done a pretty decent job. I'm going to go ahead and click on the layer mask button down here on the right side, and that just gives me a layer mask. Now I'm going to create a new layer, clicking down here on the adjustment layers, and I'm going to create a solid color adjustment, just set it to kind of a darker gray, and bring that below my subject. Now we can have a good idea of the quality of our selection. Now as you can see, there's a lot of mistakes and whatnot, but this is something that we can easily fix. So clicking on the layer mask of the subject layer, that's this black and white image that's on my layer, I'm going to press B so I have the brush tool, and I can use black and white to reveal or hide parts of my image. And if I alt click on the layer mask over here, you can see this is what the layer mask looks like. Anything that's white is visible, anything that's black is fully transparent or invisible, and anything in between, any gray values in between, are going to be those varying levels of transparency. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this because honestly I don't like to spend a lot of time on my image cutouts, just because most of these images are seen on Instagram or Facebook or whatnot, so there's no point in spending tons of time on something that's never going to be really seen. But I am going to go over some of the glaring issues. Now, for example, looking at this helmet, there are some shiny parts of the helmet that are actually, if I look at the layer mask, you can see they're actually transparent, but they should be opaque. And it might not be noticeable right away. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to click on that solid color adjustment layer, and I'm just going to change it to something that's a little bit like, I don't know, unnatural colored, I guess. Maybe green or something. Sure, that works. Just so I can see what's going on. So I'm clicking back onto the layer mask of my subject. With the brush tool, I'm going to have white selected, and it's just full hardness or like 80% hardness, whatever, doesn't matter. And I'm just going to start painting back these areas that should be fully opaque. And this process, again, you could take as much time as you want with something like this. You could spend a long time getting every edge perfectly clean, or you could or you can go quick with it. So I think this gray area back here is actually something that's supposed to be transparent. I'm just going to use the magnetic lasso tool or the polygonal lasso tool, since these are straight edges, or mostly straight. And I'm just going around this subject. I could just go in with a brush tool and paint it, but I don't know. I'm not. So I got that selection. Switch it to black so it paints things away or hides things. And again, I'm painting on the layer mask of this subject layer, not the actual image itself. Always make sure you can see this if you look over here in the layer stack, whatever's highlighted is what you're painting on. So right here, the image is highlighted. If I click on this, the image mask is highlighted. So it's important that you're painting on the image layer mask on this step right here. So again, just going through and cleaning up some of these edges that should be opaque. Is this? No. That's looking good right there. And it is a good idea before you do anything to really actually create a backup of everything. So here's my original layer. Delete the layer mask. And I'm just going to keep this unchanged, just in case I need to go back to it, or if I mess up or something like that. We'll just name this backup. Another really important thing to note is practice layer management and just organization as you edit, especially if you're doing things in 3D. Stuff can get very confusing very fast, or it can get very complex and very complicated. So it's always a good idea to practice layer management, object management, and just general organization. Name your layers, name your objects and groups and whatnot, just so you know what's going on. Oops. So since this process is pretty straightforward, all I'm doing is switching back and forth between the brush tool, between white and black on the brush tool, hiding things, revealing things, hiding things, revealing things. There's not a lot of secrets to know here. There's not a lot of things to talk about and whatnot. It's just kind of the most laborious, time-consuming part of this process. So I'm going to go ahead and speed through this process, just so you guys aren't watching me have dead air and not talk at all while I go through this. And I'll see you guys when I finish this part up. Okay, so I've finished cleaning up the edges a bit, and I should make note that I'm using a Wacom tablet pen, or really any brand of tablet will work. It's much quicker and easier to use than a mouse, but you could do this with a mouse. It would just take a lot longer, and your wrist might hurt a bit more than mine. Now that I've finished cutting my subject out from the background, I'm going to go ahead and just turn this back to something that's neutral gray. What I want to do is adjust my framing and my crop and my aspect ratio to something that I want to carry over for the rest of the image, because it's just going to make things easier. I shot this in portrait orientation, as you can see, but I like to deliver my photos in something that's landscape, so a little bit wider than it is taller. So I'm going to go over here to the crop tool, and just by default set to 2:3, an aspect ratio of 2:3, which is what I want for this image. Again, it could change depending on the image or what you want. I think I'm going to maybe kind of cant this. You can see that his legs here are canted, so he's a little bit leaning to his right, or camera right, rather. So I'm just going to kind of match the framing with that in the crop. Maybe something a little bit more dramatic, a little more stylized. And because the subject is facing camera right, or leaning camera right, I want a little bit more empty space on the camera right side of the photograph than I do on the left side. So I'm going to kind of just shove this over a little bit like that. And yeah, something like that looks pretty decent. We'll go with that. Okay, great. So I've done all the steps that I really need to do now to prep for doing things in 3D. And so when I'm creating a background in 3D, I want a reference image of my photo, of my original photo, so that way I can make sure the perspective and everything lines up, right? And just so I know that the composition of what I'm creating in 3D will look good, or look as good as it can be when I bring it back into Photoshop. So I'm going to turn off this background layer. And so you should by this point have just a blank background and your subject cut out and nothing else. At this point, you want to save the image with transparency. Typically, that'll be a PNG or TIFF image format, and you just want to make sure that you have transparency checked if there's a box for that, or alpha channel enabled. It might say that too, depending on the program you're using. So here in Photoshop, I'm going to go to File, Export, Export As. I'm going to wait for this box to pop up. Now you can already see here I have PNG selected, and that's fine, that's what I want, and there's a box for transparency because I want to keep that transparent background. If I get rid of that, it's going to fill it in with something white or black or gray, something like that. I don't want that. I want a transparent background. The image size, just so things are a little bit quicker in 3D, I'm going to make this a little bit smaller than what it originally is. I think it's 6,000 pixels wide roughly right now. I'm just going to make it 3,000 wide. Convert to sRGB, sure, that's great, and hit export. And go ahead and pick a location that you want to save this image to. And I'm just going to name it the name of the image _ cutout, just so I know what this image is. Now I'm going to go ahead and save this and minimize this, and I'm going to open up Blender. Okay, so here we are inside of Blender. I'm using the latest stable release, Blender 4.2, and I have screencast keys enabled so you guys can see what I'm doing in the bottom here, but that's not too important. So this is the default project or the default setup. Nothing, I haven't done anything to it at all. This is what it's going to look like when you install Blender 4.2 for the first time. So before we get started building our scene, there are some things that you want to do to set up Blender so it works for what our purposes are. So first things first, go up to Edit, Preferences, and if you haven't already, make sure you click on the add-on tab here, and then click on or type in this box Node Wrangler. That'll just, we'll get to that later. Just enable that for now. And what I also like to do is if you click on Navigation tab here, click on this box called Orbit Around Selection. And then click on Save Preferences and close out of this box. Now what Orbit Around Selection does is when you click on an object, whatever you have active, your camera will orbit around that. If I click on this here, you can see it orbits around that. And it orbits around the object's center origin point. So first things first here, there's a lot of things inside of Blender or really any 3D package. There's a whole lot of buttons and menus and features and this and that. And don't concern yourself with trying to learn everything. Honestly, most of these 3D package programs have a lot of abilities and you can do a lot of different things, and you don't really need to learn everything about the program to do the things that you might want to do. Some people specialize in just lighting. Some people specialize in animating. Some people specialize in character design, whatever. There's a million different things you can do inside of a 3D package. Only learn the tools that you need to know to do the thing that you're trying to do. Since we're not rendering out an animation of a video, we don't need to worry about any of these settings just yet. All right, great. So we have, one more thing. What I like to do, and I like to do this with all of my Blender scenes, is it's important, it's always a good habit to establish or model to scale. And what I mean by that is that you want to make sure if you have a building in 3D, it is the size of a building in real life. Or if you have a person in 3D, it is the size of a person in real life. And I know it might seem kind of arbitrary, and in most cases it is, but if you're doing things like physics, or if you're trying to replicate depth of field in 3D, it's going to act the same way it does in real life in most cases. So if I have a camera and I have an aperture, my 3D camera is set to aperture 1.4, it's going to act the same way as it does if I set my real life camera to aperture 1.4 in terms of depth of field. And if your scale is wrong in 3D, it might not work as you expect. And if you're doing something like a physics simulation, or like rocks falling down or building crumbling and being destroyed, if it's too small or too big, it might not react or might not look the way you would expect it to. To help myself with modeling things to scale, and as well as with composing my background and my framing and everything, I'm going to import a human 3D model. And so what I like to do is I like to just go to mixamo.com, and you just sign in with a free Adobe account if you have one. You can click on Characters tab, and I just scroll down to Mannequin here, and I didn't click on any animations. I just left it the default animation. Clicked on Download, Format, FBX, and just hit Download. So I'm going to go ahead and I've already downloaded that. I'm going to go ahead and import it. So File, Import, FBX, because that's what it was. I'm going to navigate to where I downloaded that image, or where I downloaded that 3D model. And just like that, we have a 3D model of a person to scale. If I click on an object and I press period on the number pad, it'll zoom in on that or center it to your view. So this human, if you downloaded it from Mixamo, is going to be set to scale. So this is the size of your average human, I guess. It doesn't need to be exact to what maybe your subject is in real life. This is just a guide point. Now you will see that this thing has an armature selected or attached to it. This is just, it's like a skeleton, I guess you can say, used for posing. I don't care about that, so I'm just going to go ahead and delete that. But before I delete that, if I just hit delete now, everything gets all wonky and stuff because this character mesh is connected to the skeleton. And when I got rid of the skeleton, it didn't know what to do. So I'm going to undo that, go back to here. If I click on the character mesh itself, you can see it's outlined, not the skeleton, but the character mesh itself. I'm going to go over here to the modifiers tab, that's this blue wrench, and I'm going to just apply the, so I've applied the armature, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to unparent the character from the skeleton. So parenting things just means that it's going to copy the movement and rotation and scale of what it's parented to. So for example, if I create a cube here and I create a monkey head, and I click on the monkey head, then I shift click the cube. You can see the cube's active because it has a lighter orange, and I control P parent object. If I move this cube around, the monkey's parented to the cube, so it follows that. If I scale it, it follows that. If I rotate it, it follows that. So I want to unparent the character mesh from the skeleton. So I'm just going to click on the character mesh, hit Alt P to clear parent, and keep transformation. Now I can delete the skeleton, press X, delete. Cool, great. A lot of complicated steps for no reason really, but that's just so you have a character in here. And we'll call this human reference. And you'll notice that you have an icon over here, an eyeball, that's your visibility in the viewport. And then there's a camera icon, that's the visibility in your render. I don't want this in my render, I just want it in my viewport. So I'm going to uncheck the camera icon there. At this point, you have a pretty decent starting point for your project. So what you could do is go to File, Defaults, and Save Startup File. And that way, every time you start up Blender, it'll start up with with all the same settings that we just did. And you won't have to do this every single time. Now, what we want to do is we want to import a camera. So if I Shift A, it brings up the Add menu. You could also click on this Add up here at the top, and we want to add a camera. Now the camera is going to just be centered wherever your 3D cursor is. That's this little red and white icon. Let's just put that back to world origin. So I created a camera, and if I press 0 on the numpad, I go into camera view. And as you can see, I see nothing, right? Because if we go out of camera view, the camera is looking at nothingness behind the character. So what you can do is first you can move it if you want to outside of the camera view. So press G for grab. And when you press G and you move things around, it's going to move perpendicular to whatever view you're facing. So I'm facing it from the front right now. If I press G, it's going to move it like this. If I go to the side view and press G, it's going to move it like this. Same with the top view. If I go to the top view, it's going to move it like this. So I'm just going to kind of get it out of the way over here. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the camera, press 0 to go in the number pad, and if I press my home key, it'll maximize the camera to my view. Now, if I click on something or if I try and move around, it's going to immediately pull me out of the camera. So how do I move inside the camera view? Well, you press N to bring up the N panel, and under View, this View tab right here, you're going to click Lock Camera to View. You're going to click that box. And press N again. And so now when I move around while I'm in camera, the camera is going to move with me. If I rotate and zoom in, zoom out, the camera's going to move with me. So if I come out, this is how this is how navigating works in the viewport. If I go into camera, same thing. Only now you're looking at it through the camera. Whatever the camera's looking at is what's going to render when you hit render. So you want to make sure you set up your camera properly. Otherwise, it's just going to be, it doesn't know what to look at. So, how do we set up our camera to match our photograph? Well, I guess why would you want to do it in the first place? Well, the closer your 3D camera is, and I mean this both in settings and framing, the closer your 3D camera is to your real-life camera, the more that the background or the 3D elements that you're rendering out are going to match your photograph. Now, one of the first things you want to do is set your focal length. If I click on the camera over here in the outliner, and then over here you'll see a green camera icon properties tab appear. If I click on that, you can see that the lens focal length is set to 50 millimeters. That's the default. Now if I go back into Photoshop and I look at my original image here, I know I shot this. Actually, I don't remember what I shot this with. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this image, and I'm going to open it up in Camera Raw, because it'll tell me my camera settings. I shot this photo a long time ago. So you can see here, I shot this with the 18 to 50 millimeter at 20 millimeters. ISO 600, 800, f4. So those are my camera settings for this image. It was at 20 millimeters, f4, ISO 800 with a 1/200 shutter speed. I'm going to cancel out of that. So 20 millimeters on a Sony Alpha 6500, because this camera has a crop sensor of 1.5, 20 millimeters is actually really 20 millimeters times 1.5, which is 30 millimeters on a full frame sensor. So Depending on the camera you have, you might have a different sensor. So it's always good to look up the crop factor of your sensor. If you have a full frame sensor or a full frame camera, the crop factor is just 1. So whatever your focal length is times 1, which is just what it is. But mine is 1.5, so whatever my focal length was that I shot it at, which was 20 millimeters, I'm going to multiply that by 1.5, and I get 30 millimeters. So the Blender camera works as if it's a full-sized camera sensor, or a full-frame camera sensor. So whatever your full-frame size equivalent is on your camera, that's what you want to punch in. So I had a 20 millimeter, is what I shot it at, times 1.5, which is my crop factor. I get 30 millimeters. So now I have a 30 millimeter camera, which should match the 30 millimeters of my original footage. Now, the next thing we want to do is match the position of the camera. Where was the camera in 3D space, and what is the angle of that camera? And that's why I have this human-sized reference to help me with that. So if I go back into this camera, or if I go back into Photoshop, you can see here that I was a couple feet in front of the subject, and I was pretty close to the ground, but not all the way to the ground. And one of the best things that you can do to ensure that you have your camera properly set up is to match your horizon line. So first you match your focal length, and then you match your horizon line. Every image has a horizon line, whether you shot it in a studio or if you shot it outdoors. If you shoot it outdoors, you're going to know the horizon line. And what the horizon line is just where the horizon of that image is. So let me just demonstrate this right here. So I'm going to grab a brush and just grab red. Now, it's kind of hard to see, but if you imagine that this person was standing outside, you can see the buildings out here. You can kind of guesstimate that the horizon line is somewhere around here if he was outside. In fact, I'm going to demonstrate this. Just go in here and type in, let's just type in person. So this image right here, it's really easy to know actually it's not, I take it back. Let's go back. Perfect, this image right here. This image, you can very clearly see the horizon line of this image. It's the horizon. It's this line that goes across. That is the horizon line of this image. In this photo of this person sitting in the city, the horizon line, again, pretty visible. You can see it's the horizon going across the screen on this image. If you click on something that's a little harder, let's say, let's find out. Let's find out something that's a little bit more difficult, but still relatively easy to figure out. Here we are. Okay, cool. So in an image like this, you can't see the horizon, but there are very simple ways that you can figure out what the horizon is. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this image real quick, bring it into Photoshop. Let's make it bigger. Okay, so the horizon for this image, if you look at an image with lots of parallel lines, they're all going to converge into one area. And that is the vanishing point. And that vanishing point is the height of the horizon. So you can see these lines here, the lines here, the lines on the bottom of these buildings here, the center of the road and the side of the road lines. They all converge into one area. And that's this area right here. This point that they all converge at is called a vanishing point. And that vanishing point lives on the horizon line. So we know the vanishing point or the horizon line is at this part. And then we just have to determine kind of the orientation or the rotation of the camera. This one's pretty straightforward, so we can assume that the horizon line is roughly around there. Let's say the camera was, you know, crooked or something like that, right? Let's say they took the picture that was like this, right? Well, the horizon line is still in the same point, but it's no longer going like this. It's instead going to go something like that, right? It takes time learning to see a vanishing point, but eventually once you kind of figure it out, you'll intuitively just know where the vanishing or the horizon line is of an image. So, that being said, I kind of know intuitively that the vanishing point of this image is roughly around here. That's how I know the horizon line is around here, intuitively. Now, how can I tell that without being able to see the horizon line and without seeing any... without seeing enough parallel lines to get a converging point, right? Because the only parallel lines in here are like this couch. Oops. Well, you can look at your subject and look at references or parts of your subject that that you intuitively know the tops and bottoms of. For example, looking at this image, if I zoom in, I'm looking at this person's waist here. And if I imagine that if I like cut the person's waist in half, I guess, this would be the top of their waist, right? If you imagine it kind of like a cylinder, this is like the top of their waist. And I can't see above it. I have no idea. So I'm below this line. I know the camera is below this line because I can't see above this point. Same with the hand here. I can't see on top of his hand. If his hand was perfectly flat and not angled down, I wouldn't be able to see above his hand. So I kind of know I am intuitively below this point. And you can also actually see the cylinder here, back here. This planter pot right here, or this plant pot right here, is a cylinder. I can't see above it, right? I can't see the soil of this potting plant of this. Can't talk today. I cannot see the top of this plant pot. So I know the camera's below that. And I can see above his shoe. I know I'm above his shoe, right? So I know I'm above this point. So my camera lives somewhere around here. Wherever the camera height is where the horizon line is. Wherever your camera was when you took the photo, that's the same height in the image where your horizon line is going to be. So I know that I was crouched down on the ground when I took this photo. And I was probably at the same height as the tip of this gun, maybe a little bit above his knee and a little bit below his waist, right? That's where I was in height-wise when I took this photo. That's where the horizon line is going to be. If you can figure out where the height of your camera was when you took this photo, you can figure out the height of the horizon line. So again, this is the horizon line height, and then because this image is crooked, right, the horizon line is going to be slightly crooked, probably something like that, right? So if I go ahead and just click Shift A to add a plane, and let's just scale this up a bunch, like 100 times. So when I had that with an object selected, press S for scale, and then you could either move your mouse, and it depends on how close your mouse is to the center of the object when you press S. If I have my mouse really close to the center and I press S, it's gonna move really fast. It's gonna be hard to control it. If I have my mouse way out here and I press S, it's gonna be nice and gradual. Also, if you hold Shift when you move, you can get a nice gradual adjustment as well. But I'm just gonna press S and type in 100 to scale it 100 times. Maybe another 10 times, so 1,000 times. So this is a massive, huge plane that goes what it seems like infinitely in every direction. This line now, what we see here, is the horizon line. So we want to go ahead and match that with our original image. Well, how do we match that without being able to see our original image? We want to first bring that image that we saved out of Photoshop into 3D. So clicking on the camera in your outliner, and then clicking on the camera data properties, or the object data properties of the camera on this tab here, we want to scroll down to where it says background images and click that box. And then we want to open up this drop down menu and click on add image. And then we're going to click on open. And we're going to navigate to where we saved that transparent background. So I've brought the image into Blender now. The image that I saved has the same aspect ratio as my Blender project, so there's not going to be any stretching or warping, and it should be exactly perfectly centered in your view. Now you might notice it's behind everything. I want it in front of everything so I can line things up better. So when I still have this properties menu open, I'm going to click on depth front, so it's in front of everything, and then I can use this opacity slider to kind of adjust the opacity of my background image. Again, if things look skewed or wonky or weird, it's because your project resolution aspect ratio does not match your Photoshop image or the image that you saved out. So now that I have this saved out, I can start lining up my camera. So I'm going to click on the object human reference, and I'm going to start zooming in closer. If at any point in time you start like moving around and like you just can't zoom in anymore, or you can't zoom out anymore, sometimes you just kind of have to reset your view. So just click on an object. I'm going to click on the human, and I'm going to press period key to refocus on that subject. And so now I can zoom in and zoom out properly. So I'm going to line up the human reference left foot, camera left foot, with my subject, the position of it, and then I want to kind of line up the scale. So obviously you can see here this person is way taller than my subject. Now my subject is crouched down a little bit, but it's still way too big. And you can kind of tell here, like this is the knee. Here's the knee of my 3D model, and here's the knee of my subject. So we should probably scale things down or move the camera back a bit until the knee is close to the same size. This is just a ballpark figure. You don't have to be exact. But I can now tell that this camera, in relation to the human size reference, is in the right position in terms of closeness to the subject. This human is pretty much the same size as my subject. Now we want to match the horizon line. Remember that horizon line is going through the thighs, and it's slightly canted to the camera right side. So what we're going to do is, what I like to do is, instead of moving around like this inside of the camera view to do this, I'm going to click on the camera and then just bring my mouse into the viewport and click on R for rotate. And what that's going to do is, since I have the camera selected, it's rotating the camera. If I get out of camera view, what you can see what I'm doing is I'm rotating the camera around, right? Just like any other object. We go back into camera view, and I remember that that horizon line is going through the subject's thighs, right? So right now it's a little too high up, I think. So what I'm going to do is actually I'm going to press Shift Tab or Shift tilde. That's a little squiggly key, and that lets me look around in first person point of view. Right click to cancel, left click to accept the changes. I'm going to Shift tilde, and holding Shift so I can do smaller movements, I'm going to position it so the horizon line is going through my subject's thighs, where it was in the original image. And then I just press Enter or left click to do that. Click on the camera again, and now I'm going to press R and give it that slight rotation that I had in the original image. Perfect. So now I have my camera perspective, my camera focal length set up, and I have my camera perspective set up. It's locked in. My camera perspective matches my original subject. That horizon line is going through my subject's thighs. The camera is set up in the right position in relation to the human size reference, and I have the correct focal length set up. At this point, you're not stuck with this position. You could click on your camera and let's say R and press Z for the Z axis and rotate around and look around. As long as you don't look up and down at all, like this, you're not going to ruin your perspective. And you could also move things around left and right if you want to. And that's not going to ruin the perspective either. If I go up and down, left and right, the perspective stays the same, just the camera position moves around. But I'm going to go ahead and zoom in a little bit and just match that. Cool. And something about that looks right. Going back to some navigation real quick. I told you G is to grab things, S is to scale things, and R is to rotate things. Now, when you rotate things, it might just seem kind of random. Like, why is it rotating like this? Well, if you just press R when you have a subject or an object selected, it's going to do that adjustment perpendicular to your current view. So if I face it front on, press R, it's going to rotate it around, centered around that view. If I go to the side and press R, it's going to rotate it around that view. If I go to the top view and press R, it's going to rotate it around that view. And whenever I'm canceling these things out, I'm just pressing right click to cancel it. But you can also move things according to the axis of the scene. So if you look up here at the top right, here's the Z axis going up and down, the Y axis goes forward to back, and the X axis goes left to right from this orientation. So if I press R and X, you can see the X axis appears and it rotates around that axis. If I press R and Y, you can see the Y axis appears and it rotates around that axis. And again, same with the Z axis. If I press R and Z, it rotates around that Z axis. The same thing with grabbing and moving. If I press G and Z, it goes up and down only. If I press G and X, it only goes left and right. So some good things to know. So when I'm in my camera view, if I want to rotate my camera, like look left or look right, I can click on the camera, put my mouse in the viewport, press R to rotate, and press Z, and so it's only rotating around that Z axis. If I get out of my camera view and I do that same thing, R and then Z, you can see what it's doing. It's just rotating around the Z axis. I'm not adjusting the angle of my view at all, looking up or looking down, because that'll ruin the perspective. I want that horizon line to stay the same. It doesn't matter if my camera is way up in the air. My camera could be way up in the air. If I go back in, the perspective is still the same. So if he's on top of a building, the camera height in relation to your subject, or the angle, is still the same. So I'm going to undo that though, because I liked it on the ground. I wanted to match my subject. Perfect. So I now have a scene that is prepared for me, or I have a scene that is prepped now for me to start building and assembling my scene. So I'm going to get rid of this plane. I'm going to click the plane, click delete, and I now have a human size reference and a camera. So now at this point we want to start bringing in our subjects, right? We want to start bringing in our 3D models. Now this is not a 3D modeling tutorial at all, so because of that, we're going to be using free models that I find on the internet. So if you're following along, you don't need any modeling skills, and you don't need to purchase any 3D models. You can use everything that I'm using for free. So just to show what I'm doing, I went on over to, I'm going to close this out and close this out. I went on over to Sketchfab. Sketchfab.com has a lot of really great models made by people that they upload it. A lot of great ones for sale that you can purchase for cheap. And in this case, this person, he uploaded, or they uploaded this image for free to use. People can download it and use it however they want to, or within the license attribution. So this person made these really cool cyberpunk buildings, whatever, that are actually pretty highly detailed for what they are. So I gone ahead and downloaded this from Sketchfab. You can see here I have a couple different buildings made by the same person, all for free, that I'm going to use in this photo. To download these, you just create an account, and if the image is free to use, you can see it right here, it says download 3D model. So I just clicked on download 3D model, and you'll get a list of the available formats that you can download it in. Sometimes it's a blend file, which is good for you. Sometimes it's FBX, which is usually what you're going to want to get, FBX or OBJ. In this case, the original format was .glb. I'm not exactly sure what .glb is, but I went ahead and just downloaded that anyway. And I did that for this building, this building, this building, and this building, all made by the same person, by the way, and all for free. And then I went ahead and downloaded this this cool like cyberpunk bridge thing, made by this person right here, again for free to use. Thank you very much, I appreciate that. And I'm doing this to kind of show that you can build cool 3D environments without having to know how to model them. A lot of times you can get things for fairly cheap, and in this case free, that work perfectly for the image that I want. I'm not exactly sure if I want to use all these things, but I just went ahead and downloaded these 4 buildings and this bridge, and we'll just see kind of how it fits into the image. Again, because this is more of a full walkthrough and less of an editing breakdown, you're going to see a lot of my mistakes. You're going to see a lot of the things that I'm doing here that I might undo later. You're going to see me kind of think about how I want to build my scene and whatnot. And it's going to be messy, it's going to be hard to follow along, but hopefully this gives you more of an idea of my process. So again, I downloaded all these buildings. When I downloaded this bridge, this one had an FBX model, so I was good, and I just downloaded that. And then I just brought the zip files into this folder called assets, and I just extracted all the files into this. So here, this is the Brutalist building. If I click on here, you can see source. There's the .glb. That's the 3D model itself. And if I click on textures folder, you can see these are all the textures. Everything in 3D is made up of, or everything in 3D has materials, right? So this building is made up of a 3D model, which is like you can think of it as like the physical form of the building, and then it has materials on it, right? In this case, this balcony has a concrete material on it. This satellite dish or air conditioner has a metal texture on it, or in this case, it probably has a picture of an air conditioner. And you can even see, actually, if I go over to the textures tab, and if I click on this first texture right here, this is actually a picture of an air conditioner that they use to texture the physical 3D model of the air conditioner itself. So that's not important to know so much, but just know that when you're downloading objects from the internet, you're going to get the 3D model file, which could be .fbx, .obj, .glb in this case, and in most cases you're going to have textures. So in this case, we have the albedo, which is the color. We have the normal map, which you don't need to know what it is exactly. Just know that it gives extra details to things. And then a roughness map. This just says where on the object is rough and where on the object is shiny. So we're going to go ahead and start building our scene. So I guess, like I said at the beginning, organization is very important. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my camera and my human, shift clicking both of these, and then bring my mouse into the viewport here and press M to move to a new collection. I'm going to create a new collection and name this, I don't know, lights, camera, and stuff. Sure, whatever. Just things that aren't the actual 3D scene, right? Or things that aren't like the buildings and whatnot. Actually, let's just call this camera and stuff, because I'm going to have a separate collection for lights. Keep in mind that when you import an object into Blender, it's going to go into whatever selection or whatever collection that you have highlighted over here. So if I have this collection highlighted, it's going to import into there. If I have this collection highlighted, it's going to import into there. Just in case things disappear and you're not sure where it's at, that's why. Now, before we get started, or before we do anything, before we start importing things and building a scene, save your project. So File, Save As. I'm going to go to my folder where I'm saving everything, and I'm going to just name this, I don't know, Cyberpunk Dude Background. Name it whatever you want, and just hit save. Okay, so now that we have this saved, I'm going to create a new collection and let's call it buildings, right? And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to File, Import, and I'm going to go over to .glb. Actually, the new Blender allows you to just click and drag. So I'm going to import this first building, and actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to import the concrete dwellings. That is this 3D model first, because I'm going to have my subject probably something like this. By the way, the cool thing about Sketchfab is you can preview the 3D models in the browser, and they'll help you kind of get an idea of, you know, like what your scene's going to look like, or the layout. So I'm going to want my character in like an alleyway or something like that, probably around here. So this is going to be my first 3D model that I build. It's always a good idea when you're building scenes is to start around your focal point and expand from there. So my focal point, of course, is my subject, and I'm going to expand from there. So building collections highlighted. Open up this folder. I'm going to go to the dwellings, go to source, and and this one happens to be a .fbx. That's great. I'm just going to click and drag the FBX into Blender, and then in here in Blender, it's just going to ask me some things. Most of the time, you don't really need to click on anything here. So just hit import FBX. And it might take a few seconds or sometimes a minute, depending on how fast your computer is, before everything loads up. In my case, it's finished. So boom, if I zoom out, you can see here, I have the 3D model, right? Now, I don't know if the person that made this 3D model made it to scale. As in, I don't know if it's 1-to-1 size of how big an actual building is. So we can adjust that. So what I'm going to do is first, before I start clicking things, now you can see that this object is made up of a bunch of different things. If I click on, you know, the various components of this 3D model and just press G, you can see I can move things around, right? But I want to set the scale of everything first to make sure it's matching my scene. I also want to set the position of that. And a really easy way you can do that is, you can see if I go over to the buildings tab, we'll name this building 1 actually. Let's name this building 1. And we can see all these objects that it imported are all these objects. If I click on the top one and shift click to the bottom one, it selected all of those in there. I could also right click this collection and click on select objects, and it'll select everything. And this is good to do if it has like thousands of tiny little objects that you imported and you don't want to click on each one or scroll to the big bottom of the list. Just right click the collection that it's in and select objects. And now I can press G to move things around. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to line up the 3D model, set the floor, or this floor of the 3D model is lined up with the floor of my 3D scene, because that's where my human size reference and camera is. So I'm going to press G and just move this down, and you can kind of see here by person. And just looking at this right off the bat, it actually looks to scale. If I bring this up a little bit so that the ground intersects the feet, this actually looks pretty standard 1-to-1. So kudos to the person who made this building. It's at a 1-to-1 scale. And actually, if I real quick, if I click this person, press X to move it over. Another navigation thing, if you press, let's for example, G for grab, if you hold shift and click on an axis, it'll move it on everything except for that axis. So I want to move it just around without going up and down. Up and down is the Z axis. So if I press G, shift Z, just clicking it, not holding it, it'll move everywhere on any axis except for the Z axis. So I'm just going to do that and quickly line up my character with this door over here, because people know intuitively how big doors are. And you can see here, yeah, that's pretty close to a human size reference. Maybe this human is a little bit taller for the door. Maybe like something like that might look right, but we're not trying to be super precise here. We're just trying to make sure that it's roughly the right size. And looking at that, it is. I could probably safely assume that the rest of the buildings made by this person are also at the same scale. But yeah. Another thing. Let's just say that this building wasn't set to scale, right? Let's just say it was too big or too small. And let's also say we want to rotate this around, right? In fact, actually I do. If I go into my camera view, I want to see down the length of this catwalk here, of this this walkway. So the building isn't oriented the right direction. Now I could select everything and then press R and start moving things around, and scaling things and whatnot. That's the easiest way to do it. But I want to treat this as one building, right? So remember when I talked about parenting things? You can parent objects to other objects to copy any kind of movement, rotation, and scale. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do Shift A and create an empty. And I'm just going to click on plane axes. That's fine. If I press period and zoom in on that, this empty isn't actually anything. All this is just a representation of position, scale, and rotation. It doesn't look like anything when you render it out. It's invisible. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't have geometry to it. It's just a reference point. So I'm going to shift or control Z to undo moving that. So it's just sitting there in the center. So I'm going to click on all these objects here. Shift click on all these building objects, right? And then I'm going to shift click on the empty. That's this line right here. And you're going to notice that I have everything selected, but one of them is a different color. It's going to show in your viewport and in your outliner on the right side here. The darker orange are selected objects, and the light orange is also a selected object, but it's the active selected object. And that might not mean anything to you. It might sound confusing, but it allows you to do specific things. So for example, because I have the empty active and everything else is just selected, if I press Control P for parent, I can set parent to the active object. I'm going to do active object and keep transform. That way nothing moves around suddenly. And so nothing's changed. Except for if you look in the building outliner, you can see it just says empty and all those building objects disappeared. Well, if I see this empty and I open it up, you can see now all these building objects are a parent or are a child of this empty. So now if I click on the empty and just the empty, and I press G for move, it moves the whole building together. If I press scale, it scales everything together. If I rotate, it moves everything else together. So I'm going to go into my camera view. I'm going to press, G for grab. I don't need to move it up and down. But let's first get the orientation correctly. So I'm going to press R and Z, so it rotates this. And it might be hard to see what you're doing at first, so I'm going to actually get out of camera view. I'm going to just do it from this view first. So if I press R and Z and rotate, I can see what's happening here. And this is why it's important to have a human-sized reference, because you can build your scene around that human-sized reference, and you'll know where it's going to be, where your subject in the photograph is going to be in relation to everything else. So I actually want this character all the way down here at the very beginning, because I want to have that depth, right? I want to have the walkway going off towards the background. So I could move my camera and my subject and move them back here. But I'm going to keep them centered in the world. And instead, again, I'm going to click on that empty. And it might be hard to click on it in here sometimes, or you might not know where it's at. So just you can click on it in the outliner over here. And I'm going to press G and Y and move it back like this. And I'm just going to keep... it's basically just a back and forth between pressing G for grab, moving things, rotating things, and just going back and forth until you get something that you like. So I'm going to press G, Shift Z, so it moves around on just these axes. If I hold Shift now, it'll do it slower. So I'm going to move it around right here. And this is looking pretty good. I'm liking this right now. I'm going to go back in my camera view now. And this looks pretty good. I'm going to, for now, I'm going to click on my human size reference and press H and hide that. And then we go back on my empty for the building. I'm going to press R and Z and just kind of move things around. I want it to be at this kind of an angle. Press G, Shift Z, move things around. At this point, you're just trying to find a strong composition. Something that has like a lot of leading lines. Or in this case, this does have a lot of leading lines, and it kind of brings all the focal point of those leading lines towards my subject. So the leading lines right here, on this, here, and here, and here, and here. You can see all these leading lines. They all converge, of course, on the horizon line, but you can also think about that as a framing device. I want these buildings to frame my subject. So instead of having, you know, like instead of having, you know, a subject right here or something like that, or facing a wall like that, you could. Let me undo all that. But in this case, I want to have everything framed up nicely. Now, once I get it relatively in a center position, I could also just click on my camera and press R. R, you can rotate like this. If you double tap R, you can do, it's like, kind of like a trackball, and it moves around like this. So I could adjust my, I'm making sure that I don't adjust my perspective at all. I'm just adjusting the rotation at all. So I'm moving things in a way that the buildings kind of frame my subject. So you can see these buildings kind of all lead towards my center of my subject. Great, perfect. Now we got a good starting point. Now, we're looking here in the viewport, and you might ask yourself, why do things look like this? Why is everything gray, right? If I go back to Sketchfab, you can see here all these materials. You can see all the concrete and the dirt and all these textures. If we go back into here, we don't see any of that. Well, that's going to depend on your viewport shading. So, or the view of your viewport. So here is our viewport, right? This is where we see everything in 3D space. And at the top of your screen here, you're going to see these little circles. If I click on this first one, it's this is the wireframe. If I click on that, you're going to see the wireframe of the subject. This is the actual 3D mesh of this object. It's how the thing is built. If I click on the second one right here, this is the default. This is the solid view. This just shows, you know, usually just a gray representation of your scene. If I click on this next one over here, this is called viewport shading, or this is called the this is called the material preview. And this is where you can preview your materials. It's not the render view. You're not going to get accurate lighting, and your materials might not look 100% accurate, especially if it's something like glass or whatever. But it will give you a good representation, or a quick representation, of the materials in your scene. Now, when you first click on viewport or material preview shading, when you first click on this, it has to compile all the materials. Remember all these, if I click on these textures, all these images and whatnot, it has to load all these images in and think about it and build it. And it might take a few minutes. And if your computer's slow, it could take like 10 minutes, something like that. But you can see it's now finished. Okay, so real quick, before I move on, I want to talk about texturing and materials inside of Blender, because it's a very important subject and something that you're going to definitely want to know about how to handle things, especially if you're downloading models from the internet and they're not things that you've made yourself. So in this case, when I loaded up this model, when I brought this model into Blender, it immediately loaded up all the proper textures. It just immediately knew where everything was supposed to be. It loaded up properly, nothing's missing, and that's great. That's a best case scenario. But sometimes the textures are missing. Sometimes they need to be re-added. Sometimes they're not even on the models at all. Okay, so to simplify things, let's just look at this one object. Now, if I click on this circle at the very bottom, this is the Material Properties tab. And if I just expand this window right here, on this selected object, these are all the materials that are on this object. And these materials, it might be one material, it might be hundreds of materials. It just depends on how the person made the material or the 3D object and how they distributed it to other people. So sometimes these materials might not be here. So let's pretend first, in one case scenario, let's pretend that the textures, that's the actual images that are in the materials, are missing. So what would that look like? I'm going to set this up to make it look like the materials are all missing, because this might be a real case scenario that you'll come across when you're downloading models from the internet. Okay, so sometimes you might download a model from the internet, right? And it might, once you import it into Blender, it might come into Blender looking something like this. Just doesn't look correct at all. And you might be like, oh, okay, I'll just go, I'm in the solid view, I'll go to the material preview. But we are in the material preview mode, viewport. So this is what the materials actually look like. Of course, not with realistic lighting. So what do we see here? Well, one, we just see a bunch of like solid colors everywhere, which just means no texture, or that it doesn't have a proper texture set up. And then we also see some pink textures too. And pink just means that there is a material with a texture loaded up, but the path to that texture is missing. So it knows, oh, hey, there's supposed to be this texture here, maybe concrete or tiles or something like that. It knows that there's supposed to be a texture here, and this is what it is, but it doesn't know where on your computer it's at. So we're going to try and solve these issues in case you import a model and it doesn't just work out of the box, which is most likely the case. So we want to be able to access the shader editor. Well, let me back up a bit. So if I click on if I click on this object and I click on this second to bottom icon right here, the Material Properties tab, you're going to get this list right here. And this is all of the materials on the object. These are all the materials that make up the object. There's probably material for the windows, some for the concrete, some for the walls, some for the metal pipes. Every little thing that your object is made out of, if it's one single object, those are all the materials that are on it. Now we want to be able to look at each one of these materials and figure out what's wrong with it, if there is anything wrong. But we need to access the shader editor. So to do that, if you click on the bottom corner of, or if you click on the corner of any window, you're going to see this little crosshair symbol right here. When you click and hold and move, it's going to split the current window that you're in, starting at that point. And if you want to collapse that window, let's say I want to collapse this window on the left. If I click on the bottom right, or the bottom of this right window, click and hold, instead of dragging to the left, I'm going to undo that. Oops. I'm going to click and hold. Instead of dragging away, I'm going to drag over another window, and it's going to collapse it over to that window. It only works, though, if the window next to it is lined up. So, for example, if I click and drag on the right over here, it'll only collapse over one of these windows instead of both of these windows. So, anyway, click and drag, open up a new window. And this will just create a duplicate of whatever window that you split, which is the viewport. In the top left of any window, that's a box here. This is a window, this is a window, this is a window. In the top left, you can click on this symbol and see all the different window options, I guess. We want to click on the shader editor. And then by default, the end panels open up. Let's just click on the end to close out of that. So here we can see a representation of whatever material is highlighted. So for example, we'll just start at the top of the list, tiles. And there's concrete. If I click on each one of these materials, we can see what that material looks like if you break it down. This is basically like the ingredients of the material. So let's start at the very top, tiles. So it looks here, looking at this shader editor, anything that's orange is an image. That's an image node. And those images are these images right here. right? And all the images of a material will then go into a shader. That's this guy right here. That basically just says, here's the materials and here's what they should look like in real life, kind of. So this is a properly set up material right here. Sometimes you might have a bit more nodes, but this is set up correctly. Nothing's missing like that. Nothing's disconnected. And if I actually uncheck this, you can see here that this pink is missing. So if I get rid of these, all of a sudden that pink texture goes away. So this pink texture is the tiles texture. And the reason it's pink is because it has an image loaded up and attached to it, but this image that it's referencing is missing. And I know that because if I click on this image right here, and I click on the little file icon, it's going to bring up the window, and it's looking for a texture called, or an image called this, textures.com, tiles, floor 9, blah, 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 .tiff. So it's looking for this file, and in the folder that I opened up, it doesn't exist, which means that it's somewhere else. And I moved the textures on purpose just to recreate this issue. So we got to find where this texture is. And so when you download your images from the internet, you're going to have usually the 3D model object, which is like going to be a .fbx or .obj or .something, right? A physical model or 3D model. And then you might have either individually or in a folder a bunch of textures. And so if I go to where I downloaded this and I go, oh, text, that's the folder that I downloaded with this model. I go into here. Oh, would you look at that? You have a bunch of image files. And I can guarantee one of these is probably that missing one that it's looking for. So it's looking right here. It's looking for textures.com, tiles, floor 9, blah, blah, blah. So if I scroll down, textures.com, floor 9, sure enough, here it is. And just it might have a bunch of ones that are similar. Just want to find the exact one. But we actually don't, since it's already loaded up right here in this bar, we just have to navigate to the folder. So I'm in the folder, and it exists in here. I see that. I'm just going to click on Open Image. Sorry. I guess we do have to click on it. I'm going to click on text, scroll down. I'm going to try and find this exact one. So textures.com 912.12.512.albedo. So this is the color image. So I'm going to click on that and hit Open Image. And look at that. It loaded up. But it's still missing. These maps are also missing too. So these are called maps. And that basically just means that it's referencing this image. Now, the roughness is missing. We just can't tell that it's missing. But I know it is because this one was missing too. So if we click on this, it's looking for this one called blah, 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 roughness. It's looking for a roughness map. So I'm going to go back to the other folder, text, and I'm going to find that tiles, floor 9, roughness. Here it is, this one right here. Click on Open Image. And then the last one that we're missing is the normal map. And this one is just basically like extra surface details. So I'm going to click on this box, navigate to the folder where my textures that I downloaded from the internet are, and then find the textures.com, tiles, floor 9, textures.com, floor 9, normal. And here's the normal. And hit Open Image. And so now, all these images for this material are properly loaded up. So we've solved that issue. Okay, so moving on to the next texture down here. If we click on the next material, rather, we'll see that it's missing the image maps altogether. It's missing these three: base color, roughness, and normal. Most materials will have a lot of maps. Sometimes they'll have metallic maps and other maps and whatnot. Each one of these is called a map. But the base, the minimum that you should have typically is the base color map, which is called an albedo or diffuse or color, a roughness, and a normal. With those three, those are usually like the holy trinity of material textures that you want to have at least loaded up. That'll give you the most detail. So we're looking for these three that are missing from this texture. We want to bring in these textures from the texture folder and link them up in the right spot. If you have the node wrangler enabled, which you should, with the principal BDSF shader selected, hold Control, Shift, and T, and it'll bring up the window. Then just navigate to where your textures are, You downloaded these with the object. And you might not know what you're looking for because there's no maps on here originally for you to click on. So that means nothing will autofill here. So what are you looking for? Well, in most cases, you might find that the material name, in this case, the material is called M_concrete01, usually might correlate to the name of the actual texture itself. Now this one doesn't have an M_concrete01, but it does have a concrete01. But you will notice that it has the color channel, that's the albedo, and the roughness, but there's no normal map. Now, there are lots of normal maps in this folder. There's just a whole bunch of textures for a whole bunch of materials. And I don't know which one of these normal maps is the proper one. Now, ideally, they would have named the material or the image with the same name as the material, like they did for this color and roughness. But that means, because it's missing, either one, it doesn't have a normal map to begin with, or two, that normal map is named something else that we don't know. In which case, you got to just kind of cycle through all the normal maps until you find one that looks like it properly fits the material. Now, I'm not going to do that to save time. Luckily, I already know because the material loaded up properly the first time, I know that the missing normal map is this one right here. So I have these 3 maps selected, and then I'm going to click on this Principal Texture Setup button, and it's going to automatically set up everything I need for the node. It knows that the albedo will go into base color, it knows that the roughness map will go into roughness socket, and it knows that the normal map should be plugged into a normal map node, which then routes into the normal map socket of the shader. And you can see here, it loads up just fine. Now, when I was talking about loading up the normal maps and seeing if it loads up properly, well, how do you know if a normal map loads up properly? Well, a normal map is extra details, right? So if I remove this, if I just undo this, if you see right here on the screen, all of a sudden everything looks really flat. Everything looks really flat right there. But if I load this normal map back into here, all of a sudden you see these details, and they line up properly. It looks correct to me. It might not be correct, I don't know for sure, but it does look correct. Everything, all the lines line up, the damages line up with the lines. So this would be where you would try out different ones. So if that normal map doesn't work, you would go back in here and click on a different normal map, and you can see here that one just all kinds of way off, right? Like, what is going on here? If I get rid of this, it's flat here. If I put this back, it's just all kinds of messed up. So this normal map belongs to a different material altogether. So I'm going to go back and load up that proper normal map and continue on with the rest of the materials. Okay, so I've relinked everything, and coincidentally, all the rest of these objects that I imported that make up the entire building all share the same materials. And so because I relinked the materials of one object, all the other objects that have that same material will already have the work done. So again, to close this window, just click on the bottom right or the bottom corner of the window you want to keep, drag it over, and you got this. And I forgot to mention earlier, I soloed this object in my view by pressing the / key. If you press it again, it'll just bring everything back into view. So if you want to solo something in your view, click on an object, press the / key, and it'll just solo that only in your view. But you can see here, everything's loaded up properly now. So, so this object right here has a concrete 01. This object over here, it also has a concrete 01. So even though this whole building is made up of a bunch of different objects, all these objects actually have the same materials on them. So sometimes the work might be cut in half or dramatically if that's the case. So now we have something that looks a little bit more like what it does in Sketchfab. We can see all the textures. If I fly around here, look around, you can see all the stickers and the dirt and whatnot. If I go back into my camera view, press 0, you can see what we have here. Now, I originally positioned my camera here, right? But in solid view, I thought this was a wall. But if I go into material preview, I can see this is actually a wire fence. I don't want this wire fence here at all. I want like solid walls on both sides of him. So I'm just going to try and find a different place for my camera to be. So I'm going to zoom out real quick. And if I go down here, Now see, if I'm zooming in right now, it's not zooming in anymore. So I need to kind of reset my view. So I'm just going to click on this object and press period. And now I can move how I expect to. So I actually like this end of the building more. I like these. Or maybe I like something like this. Something like this kind of looks cool. A little bit more open space maybe. At this point, when you're composing your scene, right? When you're moving your 3D camera around in your scene, this is kind of like where you're thinking like a photographer, right? Imagine if this location was real. Imagine you really were in a location where this building exists, and you're with your subject, your model, whatever, and you have a real camera, and you're trying to find things that are interesting, cool compositions and whatnot, cool positionings of the building and your subject in relation to the building, and or what have you. Try to avoid things that are just flat, straight-on views, right? You want to imagine yourself in this real location, and that's what sets good photography apart from bad photography. In the same way that sets good CG backgrounds from bad CG backgrounds is your composition. You can have a simple scene and a strong composition, and it'll look better than a complex scene with a bad composition, if that makes any sense. So again, I'm going to just kind of move around here. Now, at this point, I could keep moving my building around. Actually, I'm going to do that. I'm going to click on the empty, and I'm going to stay in this view. It might be a little difficult to know what you're doing from this view, but it's important to know how things look. So I'm going to press G and Y. Actually, press G and then Shift Z, and I'm just going to kind of move along this axis. And I'm just going to play around with this until I see something that looks interesting. Something that gives like a good depth, whatnot. Maybe what happens when I'm actually way down here? Now, you can see here, things are kind of moving a little bit weird because the center of this object is this empty. So I'm going to go out of the camera view, and I'm just going to quickly move this building using the empty that I created to reposition everything. Another thing to note, if you have a trackpad or a number pad, if you press 1, it's a front view. 3, it's a side view. And 7 is a top view. If you hold Control while pressing 1, it'll do a back view. If you hold Control while pressing 3, it'll do the other side. And as you might have guessed, if you press 7 and if you hold Control pressing 7, it'll do the bottom view. So I'm gonna press 7 for the top view real quick. I'm gonna turn on my human reference again real quick. So from the top view, here's my human, here's my camera. I'm going to click on the empty of my building. I'm going to just move things around really quickly. Just so things are a little bit faster. Now, what I am going to do is, just for my own OCD purposes, I'm going to square up the orientation of this building. I'm going to square it up so it's not canted to any weird angles. And then I'm going to click on my camera and shift click on my subject or my human size reference. And I'm just going to kind of move those over so it's a little bit squared up too. I'm going to go back to my camera view and see what we got going on here. So I'm going to click on my camera, move it over something like that. All right, cool. I'm gonna hide the human reference again. So now, when I move the building, I could just move it on the y-axis or the x-axis, and it'll just be a little bit easier to move things around. So I like these buildings, I like these doors a lot. I like the details on them, and I like these railings. So I think something like this kind of position will look pretty good. Now, I'm not going to mess around with my angle because I've already set up my perspective. When I say angle, I mean my shift of looking up and down. I'm not going to adjust that at all. And I'm not going to position my camera too much or move my camera like up and down too much because I already have it at the right angle or the right height. So I'm just going to kind of keep it like this. And I'm just going to click on my camera, press R and Z, and just kind of shift this around a bit and massage this into an area that I like. Something like that. And I'm looking at this, and I'm thinking the perspective might be a little bit off, so with my camera selected, I'm going to double tap R and just kind of shift this up a little bit higher. Just a little bit. And again, this is just from my own intuitive sense of what the horizon line should be. The closer the closer your horizon line is to your image, the better it's going to be. The better it's going to match, rather. Okay, great, cool. So we have a basic starting point for a background. Before I start bringing in the other buildings and whatnot, I might not even bring in other buildings. I might just keep it simple like this for the purpose of this tutorial. Of course, you know, if you wanted to, I can click on this building collection, building 1, right? I can right click it and duplicate collection. Now I have another collection called building 1.001. We'll just call this building 2. Now it's in the exact same spot as the first building. But if I click on that empty and move it, that duplicated empty, you can see here that I have a copy of that building. Now you could get away in 3D with using the same asset over and over and over again. You can get away with it pretty well as long as you're changing up the position and the orientation, the rotation, and the scale of these objects to not be the same repeating over and over and over again. So I'm just going to click on this one and rotate it like 90 degrees this way. And then already, you know, from this angle, that looks like a totally different building. Now, that was redundant because you can't even see it anyway because it's below the visibility of this. Actually, you can kind of see it, but the subject would be in the way. But you can cheat it if you want to. You can maybe bring it up here and kind of move things up like that. If I turn my subject back on, yeah. Now, obviously, be careful because you can see the bottom underneath this, which there's no floor or anything like that. So keep that in mind. You could also scale things up really big and move things up. But I'm going to keep the scale the same. And I'm just going to maybe just bring in a little bit more detail back here. Something like that. Again, I'm keeping note of the silhouette of my subject in relation to everything else. The way these buildings right here kind of match the angle of the elbow. I like that. So I'm just going to kind of put that there. And this looks good for now. I think the rest could be just maybe like a nice cool sky, or I might just keep it simple and have like a plain background. But yes, okay, so we have positioned our camera and our buildings in a way that we like. We like this look and whatnot, but something else is missing, right? And that's the lighting. The lighting is missing. The lighting, there is no lighting. This is just a material preview. All this is just a flat representation with like no lighting of what the materials look like. But this actually isn't an accurate representation because there's no lighting and the materials aren't interacting with that lighting. We want that to be. Aside from the perspective and the camera's placement and the composition of your scene, the next most important thing is matching the lighting of your subject, right? This lighting here should carry over to the lighting in our scene. Now, it doesn't have to be exact. Now, this lighting right here is a little bit more of like studio lighting, you could say. I mean, obviously, I'm using like studio lights, right? But that's not what makes studio lighting studio lighting. It looks very artificial. It doesn't look like a real life lighting scenario, like he's lit by a street lamp or something like that, or lit by the side of a building with some lights coming through. It looks kind of stylized, which is fine. But you do want to generally match the direction of the lighting in your scene with your photograph, or match it to your photograph. Because if we look at just the subject here, you can tell that this character is heavily backlit. You can see a strong rim lighting coming from the side. You can see that the front of this character is in shadow, like this. The front of this fist here is in shadow. The top of the wrist is lit up. So we know that there is a light source coming from behind the subject and slightly above. We want to match that in 3D. So how do we get to see our lights in our subjects? So how do we get to see our lights? So I'm going to first create a new collection. We're going to call this Lights. And if you remember, Shift-A is how you add things, or you can click on this top bar up here. I'm going to add a light, and I'm going to add, let's just do a point light for starters. Now, if I press G and move it around, here's a point light. But again, like I said before, It's not doing anything. It's not lighting our scene at all. We don't see any lights anywhere. That's because we're still in material preview view. This far right button up here at the top is the render view. This is going to be what your scene looks like when it's rendered. It's going to think of all the lighting and represent it to you accurately. So I'm going to click on that orb or that circle. And depending on your computer, or depending on whether or not you first started a Blender or not, this might take a while. And if your project is really big and you have lots of objects and lots of lights and lots of materials, it will take a very long time, or it could take a very long time. So just be patient. And again, save. So now we can see here, we have a light. If I move this light around, it's interacting with our scene. And it might look like it's interacting in real time. It's actually just moving really, really fast. And it does look very clean. That's because of the denoiser. If I go back to the render settings and I uncheck the viewport denoise and move things around, you might be able to see things are kind of grainy and whatnot. I have a very fast graphics card, so things just move faster for me, or they compute faster. The lighting computes faster. So if you have a slower graphics card, the viewport representation might take a long time. I'm going to turn denoising back on. Now, with this light selected, this is a point light. This is basically like a light bulb. It emits lights in all directions equally. So you can think of it like a light bulb. If I get rid of this, and I Shift A and add a spotlight, and let's just move that up because it's in the ground, and move this around. As you can see here, I have a spotlight. And I think everyone knows what a spotlight is, right? It's just, someone with a spotlight pointing it towards something. Now it's kind of hard to see what's going on here, so I'm going to turn up the brightness of this spotlight. So with the spotlight selected, or any light selected, you're going to see the object data properties for a light, which is this green light bulb. I'm going to click on that, and power, 10 watts. Let's just change this to 500. And you can see here we have a more powerful spotlight that's aimed where you want it to. With the spotlight, you have some controls that aren't available with point lights. So actually, let me go ahead and delete this. Add a point light. Let's just change this back to 500 watts and move it up. And boom, you can see here. It's just a point of light that's emitted in all directions. This is probably the easiest or simplest light to use. It doesn't require aiming it in any direction. You just move it to where you want to move it, and the light interacts like that. Now already you can see this is looking really cool. This looks realistic, right? Or close to it. And that's because the person who made this material spent a long time making this object. But with the lighting looks good. It looks really cinematic. Adds nice dynamic shadows to the foreground. And you have that nice rim lighting, right? So I said you can't aim a spotlight at all. But lights do have more than just the direction of where they're aiming. They of course have the power, right? They have the color. By default, set to white. You can change this to red, green, whatever you want. You can just move this around, have fun with it. I'm going to change it back to white. If I put the saturation to 0. But it also has the size of the light. Now, lights in general, you can't press S to scale a light. But the size of that light can be controlled with the radius. So that's like the size of the light bulb, if you can imagine. So if I move this bigger, you can see representation. That's how big the light is. Now, it might not be really obvious what's going. It's not getting brighter. It's not because the light's getting bigger. It's not getting brighter. But what's happening is it's affecting the quality of the shadows. Just like in real life, when you have a small light source, it emits hard shadows. When you have a big source, like the sky or a softbox, you get soft shadows. And that same thing happens in 3D. Let's look at the shadows on... it's a little hard to move around here, but let's see what's going on. Okay, let's look at the shadows cast by this railing here. So I'm going to turn the size of the radius back to 0. So you can see that the shadow here cast by this railing is very hard. It's a very definitive, sharp line shadow here. And that's because our light source right now, if you look at the radius, is set to 0. It's infinitely small, so it has infinitely sharp shadows. If I start bringing this radius up bigger, you can see all of a sudden those shadows get softer. Now, this can be a stylistic choice of what you want, but in general, it might be a good idea to relatively match the lighting quality of your subject. So if you go back here, or if I go back here, I lit this with two softboxes, one on each side of my subject, just behind them. And I had a large softbox kind of up above the camera that you can't see. And that just kind of helps fill in the shadows a little bit. That's not very directional lighting. A little bit it is, but it's mostly just to kind of fill in shadows. But the most directional lighting we got here is from these two softboxes, which are coming from behind. And they're relatively soft. It's not like a single light bulb pointed at my subject. It's a big light source, and it's close to my subject. So I get softer shadows. And you might be able to see that in... it actually is kind of hard to tell. If this person didn't have their mask on, you would be able to tell the softness of the shadows. But you can kind of tell here, like the side of the hand, there's a nice soft roll-off of shadow here. So I might want something in 3D that is relatively close to that, right? So I think what I have here already looks pretty good. Now we want to position it, right? We want to position it in relation to our subject. So I'm going to go back into camera view. And you can see here, things are just looking off, right? Well, first off, let me go back to the camera, click on the object data properties and background image. Let's set this to full transparency. Now let's go back to the light and press G. We can start moving this thing around. Now I want this to be a little bit further back. So I'm going to press G and then just move it back. And I'm just going to try and find a lighting that looks pretty good. Now, like I said, this is a point light, right? So it kind of spills light everywhere, even backwards, and it fills in the lighting on all these buildings back here. Maybe that's something you want, maybe that's not. If that's not something you want, you can use a spotlight instead. Now, what you could do is you can just create, you can click on spotlight on this light right here, and it just turns that from a point light to a spotlight. And now, if I double tap R, I can aim it around. And you can see the light only goes there. So this will just give me a little bit more control over the directionality of my light. Now, spotlights also have additional controls. So there's, of course, the radius, right? Just like the point light. That controls the softness of the shadows. But it also has the spot size. If I just zero this out, the rotation, the spot size is the size of the spotlight. And the blend is how hard the blending is from the edges to the center. So I'm going to turn the blend up all the way. I'm going to turn the spot size up a bit. And I'm just going to double tap R to aim it this way towards the camera a bit more. Go back to camera view. And I'm going to press G and move this up a bit higher. And maybe to the left more. And at this point, again, just like you're positioning your camera in 3D and you're thinking like a photographer, you want to do the same thing with lighting. Think like a photographer. Put the lighting that in an area that looks good. Now, because I shot this with two lights, one on each side behind my subject, maybe I can try and recreate that in 3D. So I have one light over here. Let's turn that up to maybe 1,000 watts. And then let's press Shift D and move another light over here from an alternate angle. And, you know, that might not be 100% accurate to what my original lighting was, but it's just something that you could do. Maybe I'll turn the size up of this one and this one up a bit more so the shadows are a bit softer. And just play around with things. Now, if you shot this with different colored lights, again, you can play around with the colored lighting to get different effects. But I'm going to keep this white for now, just to keep things simple. Now, from here, you know, I got two lights in here, but maybe I want a little bit of like rim lighting or something on these shadowy parts right here. So maybe I might create a point light, bring that up, and just kind of bring this off to the side here, and maybe something like this. I don't know. We'll see. We'll play around with it. Turn the brightness up a bit more. Maybe we'll make it something like slightly cool blue or greenish or whatever. Yeah, that looks kind of cool. Maybe not though. Maybe it's a little too blue. If you notice that the lighting on my subject is white, right? There's no like solid or strong color cast of lighting on my subject. So if I put a blue light right here, not paying attention to the fact that the lighting doesn't match in direction, but just looking at the color alone, it doesn't really fit, right? If there was like, let's say like a lamp or something above this door, right? It looks cool, but the color doesn't really match. And I could actually probably just fake that in Photoshop, but what I want to do in this case is to try and match the lighting on my subject as much as possible in 3D. So I'm going to actually turn off the saturation of that and keep that white as well. And just play around with the position. I'm going to turn up the radius of that light a little bit just so it doesn't create such super harsh shadows. And I'm just moving things around. I can't really see what's going on too much, but I'm just creating a little bit of detail. If I turn that light off and on, you can see it just adds a little bit of detail over there. Maybe I'll duplicate that, bring that over to the left, and have it mirror that same effect. Cool. Now, these buildings in the background, right? We put those buildings there, but we can't really see anything. Oh, okay. Before I move on, I'm going to turn off all these lights, right? But we can still see lighting in our scene. If I turn off the overlays, that's this button right here. It'll just hide the grid and all that. We can still see there's lighting, right? It's subtle, but it's there, right? It's not pure black. But that's because of the world lighting. And you can see right now the world is gray. That's the world all around. If I click on this little world symbol on the right here, this is the world properties. And we can see the color is set to gray and the strength is set to 1. If I set the strength to 0, now it's black. It's not doing anything. There is no additional lighting in the scene. If I turn the strength way up, it gets brighter. So this world lighting will affect the lighting on your scene. Now, if you're shooting in a studio environment where you have control over your lighting and your subject is just lit by your lights that you place, then you might want to represent that in your scene as well, in which case I'm going to make this black. And, I mean, even forgetting everything I just said, if you just want total control over the lighting in your scene and the direction, you might want to just make this black. If I go back to my camera view and turn these lights back on, now you can still see, or now you can see that my scene is lit by only those lights and nothing else. Now, just looking at this right away, I can already kind of tell that the color of the lighting on my subject is a little bit cooler than the lighting of these lights that I chose. And that might be just the white balance of my camera. But I'm going to select these lights one at a time. We'll just do this first one. And I'm going to try and match the lighting color. So I'm going to click on that light, click on the data properties of the light, go to color, and then I can click on this eyedropper right here. And because my subject has lighting on them that are shining reflective, that's kind of the color of the light. Now, real quick, more navigation controls. If I press End, open up the End panel, and uncheck camera to view, because now that I have my camera set in place, I don't want to move it anymore. I'm going to uncheck that. And now when I zoom in and zoom out in camera mode, it just zooms in and zooms out, but it doesn't actually move the camera. The camera's staying in place. I'm just zooming in and zooming out my view. So if I go up here, and if I click, I can see here, this is probably a good representation of the color of my light. Roughly, this area. So I'm going to click on the light, click on the color, click on the eyedropper. I'm just going to sample something around there and zoom back out again. Press home key to center it. And you can see it changed the color of my light, but it's way too dark. I'm going to go back to the color, and I'm going to turn the value all the way back up to 1. And I could probably turn the brightness up to something like maybe 3000. And that's too blue. So I'm going to go to the color and just change the saturation down. I'm going to bring it down to like maybe 0.2, 0.3, something like that. And you can see there it matches pretty well. Now the cool thing about Blender is I can hover over this color and do Control-C to copy it. And then I'm going to go to each one of my other point lights and Control-V with my mouse hovered over the light color and paste it in. We'll do the same thing over here to this one and to this one. So we can see here we have our main part of the scene lit, but everything else is in complete darkness. It's completely black. Well, what if we want to see a little bit of that lighting? Now we could just bring up the brightness of our scene a little bit, and that fills in a little bit of the shadows. But that might not be something we want. Maybe we want to add some stylized lighting to that. So I'm going to zoom out, or get out of my camera view. You can see the scene here. Here's where our camera's at, and back here is the buildings. With the light collection selected, I'm going to Shift A and select another light. I'm just going to make a point light. And I'm just going to move it back. And it is not bright enough to see anything, so I'm going to turn the brightness up to like 5,000 watts. We'll just turn it crazy bright for now, just so we can see what we're doing. If I can move it around, we can see it's doing some stuff. So if I go into camera view, I don't actually want to light these buildings up at all. I want to light these buildings up back here. So, and maybe I want the light to come from below. Something like that looks kind of cool. And maybe I want a nice complementary color. So this is kind of cool tones in the front. If I change this to something that's like a little bit warmer, maybe a little more orange or yellow, that might look kind of cool. We'll see. So go back to camera view and just start moving things around. Now, I don't want the lighting to be super sharp, right? It's still infinitely small, so I'm going to turn up the radius. So it's just a big, big light source, and it creates pretty soft shadows. And I'm going to turn up the brightness to like 10K. And at this point, you're just doing some stylized lighting, right? It doesn't have to be accurate. It doesn't have to be real. You just want it to look good. So I'm just moving things around until I see something that looks good. And with lighting, a lot of the times it's happy accidents. You mess around with something until you get something that looks cool. You could be technical about it. You could be very precise about it. You could also just play around with it a bit until you get something that you like. You can see the light is getting a reflection in these windows over here. I'm not mad at that. I like it, so we'll stick with it. Actually, I'm not liking this color, so maybe something that's a little bit more. Ooh, a little red looks kind of cool. Maybe red, maybe like a red magenta, kind of something like that. Maybe not fully saturated. Yeah, I don't hate that. I like it. Now, yeah, let's just do something like this. Something like that looks not too bad. It's just something to fill in the shadows. So something to think about when it comes to assembling your scene in 3D. I could have a sky in 3D. Like I could import a 3D sky back here, or I can import, or I could have a bunch of buildings just filling up the whole sky. I think I might just want to put my sky in Photoshop. That way I can play around with it. But let's say you wanted to put a sky back here. You could do it in a couple different ways. You can use the World tab. If you click on Surface, or rather Color. Sorry. If you click on this little circle right here next to Color, you can change the texture to something that's maybe environment texture. And then if I hit, well, right now, there's nothing loaded up. So if I go to a strength of 1, it's going to be pink. This world pink color is it just means that there's no texture loaded up. So if you have a building texture or an object texture and that texture is missing, or maybe it got placed in a different location on your computer and the program doesn't know where that's at, it's just going to represent that as pink, so you know, oh, I have a missing texture here. In this case, I don't have a missing texture. I just have no texture. So you could load up an HDRI. An HDRI is basically just a 360 picture that someone made that you can load up into 3D space. So I'm just gonna load up a random one that I have on my computer. I'm gonna click on Open. I'm gonna navigate to where my 3D assets are, and I just have a bunch of HDRIs loaded up on my computer already. And I'm going to click on a random one, maybe this one. There we go. Okay, so if I zoom out, I'm gonna turn off my overlays so you can see what's going on. I have a 360 photo loaded up inside of my 3D world. It's called an HDRI. And this photo is accurately lighting my scene. So let's say you shot your subject outside in a field or in a similar lighting condition, and you want your 3D scene to have similar lighting as your real life lighting. This is how you would do that. So if I go back to my camera view, you can see here, if I turn off all my lights, this scene is entirely lit by an HDRI. And this is a very quick way to get realistic lighting because it's lit entirely by real life. So you can't really control the rotation of the HDRI because, like, for example, the sun's coming from over there, and let's say I want it to come from back here, right? Or the left side or somewhere else. I can't just control the rotation of the HDRI from this menu. I wish I could. I don't know why. But you can do that. So it's just simple. Just open up a new window like this, and then click on the top left here and change that window to the shader editor. Press N to hide this end panel. This is just a properties panel that you don't need right now. And then up here where it says object, change that to world. And here you can see this is the HDRI. Here's the picture that we loaded up. It's going into a background node or a background shader. And this shader is going into the surface of our world. So this strength right here is the same strength slider down here. If I turn it up, it gets brighter. If I turn it down, it gets darker. It acts as you might expect. But if I click on this material and press Control T, and this is where you want the Node Wrangler enabled. If you don't have the Node Wrangler enabled, it's not going to work. But if you click on this and press Control T, it'll create these two nodes. This mapping node has location, rotation, and scale. If you mess around with the rotation, you're going to get a rotation of your HDRI. If I click out of camera view, and I'm just going to rotate on the Z-axis, that's spinning around the Z-axis. If I rotate on the Y, it's going to do something wonky. Same with the X. You don't want to mess with that. Usually it's just the Z-axis inside of Blender. But you can see here, I can rotate the HDRI around. Now if I move it back here, now the sun's coming from the back of my scene. And so, again, using an HDRI is a very good way to get realistic lighting. You can see without any added lights, this scene looks fairly realistic because you got a good 3D model with good textures lit by an HDRI of a real location. So this will basically look as photorealistic as you can get it to look. In this case though, I don't want to light my scene with an HDRI, but this is how you could do that if you wanted to. So I'm actually going to click on this little X right here on the world properties to get rid of that. I'm going to change this from color back to RGB. And I'm just going to change this back to 0. Actually, maybe I'll have it at like 0.2, something like that. Just a little bit of light. And turn my lights back on. And then I'm turning my overlay back on. Now, real quick, like I said before, using HDRIs is a way to add skies in your background, in addition to lighting your scene. But right now we just have a big gray thing. And let's say we don't want that. Let's say we want to add the sky in Photoshop. Well, I can click on the Render Properties tab over here. I can scroll down to where it says Film, open that up, and then click on this box that says Transparent. And this just basically means wherever there's not something, it's transparent. And so you can see here, we have a transparent background. So when I render this object out, or I render the scene out, I'll have nothing here, and I can replace that with a photo inside of Photoshop. Now, going back to render settings, right? We were talking about aperture earlier. If I click on the camera, and let's first off, let's hide everything. You can see here, if I zoom in, everything here in the foreground is sharp. Everything here in the midground is sharp, right? Perfectly in focus. If I zoom out in the background, everything in the background is perfectly sharp and in focus. That's not accurate at all to real life. If I look at my original image, you can see here, the subject is sharp, right? Because I'm focused on them. But the background is blurry. Look, these people in the background, all blurry. The buildings, blurry. You can't see enough of the foreground, but if you could, the foreground would be a little bit blurry too. So we want to replicate that in 3D, usually. You don't have to perfectly match it, but you should definitely get in the relative ballpark. So going back inside of Blender, if you click on the camera, go to camera data properties, you can scroll down to depth of field. If I check that, it's going to have depth of field already, but it doesn't know where to focus. And you could click on focus object and click on an object, but that's not very accurate either, because it doesn't actually focus on the point that you clicked on. It focuses on the center point of that object, which could be who knows where. So instead, we want to create an empty, which will act as the focus point of our 3D camera. So I'm going to get out of camera view, turn on my overlays, and I'm going to create Shift A, create an empty, plane axis. Let's move this into the location called camera and stuff. And we'll call this focus point. Now we have an empty here, and this will be our focus point. But where do we put this? We could just eyeball it, but we have a better way of eyeballing it, and that's using our human reference. If I turn this human reference on already, we already know that this reference, or this camera, is the correct distance away from this subject, roughly. So what I could do is I could put this focus point empty on, let's say, the head, or the where the eyes would be of the subject, right here, because that's probably where I set my focus to on my camera in real life. Now let's go ahead and hide the subject, or the human reference. Go back into camera view. I'm just gonna move this down here. With my camera selected, under the data properties, I'm going to go to depth of field, and the focus object, I'm going to click on focus point. And so now if I hide everything and zoom in, you can see the background is out of focus, the foreground is slightly out of focus, and the midground, or where the subject is more sharp. Now, again, because this is the scale, everything is going to act the same way it would be in real life. And what I mean by that is the f-stop. Right now, the default is 2.8. But if you remember, I shot this at f4. So if I want to match the focal length of my original camera, I would set this to f4 as well. And so now, when I turn this on, this is going to have an accurate depth of field that matches the depth of field of my original image, or close to it, right? So what have we done so far? We've imported our camera into our scene using a human-sized reference to help us establish the position of our camera in relation to the subject, as well as establish the perspective, which includes setting our horizon line. And then we imported our buildings. We ensured that the materials of our buildings fully loaded up and were connected. And then we started building our scene, or finding an interesting composition of our camera inside of that 3D scene, thinking like a photographer, moving the camera around, and finding an area that looks interesting. And then, once we got that established, we started building the lighting of our scene. Lighting that relatively matches the original lighting of our subject, or of our camera, our photograph, as well as introducing just some stylized flair to it. Just something that looks a little bit good. And now that I think about that, I'm going to make this a little bit brighter and a little bit more saturated. Let's make this 20,000. Something like that. Actually, I think I might want to change the color of these lights. Now, real quick, if you have a light selected and you press Alt-D, so Shift-D duplicates a light. If you press Alt-D, it duplicates a light, but it keeps the same properties as the thing that was originally duplicated. So if I click on either one of these and I change the color, it'll change the color of both of them. So just a fun little tidbit to know. I'm going to play around with something maybe more yellow, a bit more green. Nah, I'm going to stick with the red. Maybe a little bit more of an orange red than a pure red. Something to match the lights on his visor. Yeah, that's looking pretty good. Okay, so at this point, I'm ready to bring this into Photoshop, and we want to render it. So there are a lot of different ways to render things, and there's a lot of different options when it comes to rendering. But the main thing you want to know is that you want to make sure is just that the aspect ratio and the resolution is set to your original photograph, so it matches inside of Photoshop. Now, under output properties, you're going to see here, you know, file format, PNG, color depth, blah, 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 blah. If you're just saving an image out of Blender, you can do this stuff on the export settings. So before I hit render, I'm going to click on the viewport shading mode to go back to here. That way my computer is not trying to render out my viewport as well as rendering the actual image. So from here, I'm going to click on render and then render image. Simple as that. So depending on the complexity of the scene, depending on how many lights and buildings and materials you have, the material sizes, the texture sizes, and how powerful your computer is, this might take a while. Sometimes an image can take anywhere from a couple minutes to a couple hours. And that really just depends on a lot of factors. So don't expect this to be something that's instant. My scene's fairly simple, and my computer is very fast, so this is actually going pretty quickly. But this might be something that you might want to go take a break, you know, have lunch, dinner, or whatever, grab a cup of coffee, go for a walk or whatever, do some errands, and come back and be ready. So boom, my render is finished. I know this because there's no thinking at the top here. It's not going over samples. I don't see anything moving. And this is the finished render. It's done. This is how I want it to look for Photoshop. Now, to save the image, though, it hasn't been saved yet. It's just rendered it. It's computed what it needs to compute, but it hasn't saved it to your hard drive yet. So go up to Image, hit Save As, find the folder that you want to save all your stuff to. I'm going to name this the name of my photograph, underscore CG for computer generated, and then underscore background. And then under the file format, PNG is fine. RGBA, that the A stands for alpha channel. Make sure you have that checked if you have a transparent background like this. And then color depth, 16-bit. Everything else I'll leave the same. And hit save image. Give it a couple seconds, and it will be on your computer. So now if I close out of this, I can hit File Save, Save Blender, close out of Blender, open up Photoshop, and let's look at our original cutout. Go to the folder that we saved that image to, and drag it into Photoshop. And then here we go, we have the image. Now, just make sure that it's scaled to fit your frame. Sometimes it comes in and it's like a little bit small or whatever. Just make sure it's there and drag it behind your subject cutout, and boom, you have your subject in a scene. Now, there's still a lot more to do to get everything to work properly, but that's it. That's the basics of it right there. Now I'm going to turn on my color fill layer, the background, and you know, I could just play around with that. I could keep that something like this, or okay, Ryan from the future here. There's one more thing that I forgot to mention. Well, there's a lot of things I forgot to mention, and I'll create other videos like this in the future, but I just wanted this one basic video to kind of go over the full process from start to finish. And I'm sure I'll refine this whole thing up and create some more videos in the future. But what else is missing from this image? Well, the first glaring issue that I'm noticing is a lack of shadow. Now, there are different ways you can there's different ways that you can create shadows or approach adding a shadow to your image. One of them might be that you retain the original shadow from the original photograph. And if you shot your image, or if you shot your subject on, let's say, a seamless backdrop or a cyc wall or a studio, or maybe just on like nice clean concrete or something like that, the shadow on the ground might be visible and you might be able to retain that. But because I shot this indoors on carpet, there is some slight shadow there. There is a little bit of shadow around the foot. Let me just circle it around. So there is a little bit of shadow there, but one, it's not visible enough, and two, I can't put this shadow on the CG background because this shadow has carpet texture all over the place. So I can go about doing this in a couple different ways. One of them would be that I manually draw in the shadow, and that that could be the case that you want to do. So for example, let me just let's create a new adjustment layer. Let's make it solid. Just hit OK for now and set it to multiply. And then let's just go ahead and go into the color of this and just change the texture or change the color of this solid there. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the layer mask of that solid color. Let's name this shadow first. Shadow. And I'm going to Control I or Command I on a Mac and invert that. And then with the layer mask selected, press B. And what you could do is you could paint in shadow. And so, you know, I'm going to do this very, very roughly because I'm not going to actually do this. This isn't the process that I'm going to keep. But I could retain the original shadow, or I could paint in the original shadow, something like that. And of course, you know, spend far more time on this than I did. And, you know, change up the brush size. If it's a soft light, right, it's going to have some softer shadows, something like that. No hard edges. So I'm just going in and just doing different layers of paint. And again, I'm painting white. Here's the layer mask for the shadow layer, which is just a solid color set to multiply. A solid gray color. And I'm painting in on that layer mask to reveal where I want that shadow to be. Now, this could work. It's not the best, most accurate shadow, and the benefit of using this method is that I can change the color of the shadow. I can even tint it a certain color if I want to make it like slightly blue or something like that. I could do that. But the issue with this is, one, it's not going to be as realistic because the shadow is just drawn, which means you're limited to your abilities as an artist that draws. I'm not a very good painter or drawer. So this is just gonna look as good as my abilities to draw a shadow will look. In this case, what I want to do is I actually want to create a shadow in 3D, because that 3D shadow will be far more accurate and realistic looking than drawing it in Photoshop. And I have a little bit of fun doing it too. So let's go ahead and delete the shadow. Actually, I'll hide it for now so we have something to compare to. Let's go back into here. Let's go back into Blender. And we want to create some objects that are invisible to the camera, but not invisible to lighting. So what I mean by that is I want to create an object that casts a shadow in my 3D scene, but I don't want to see that object. And so how can we do that? So let me get out of camera view here for a second. Let me just zoom in on this area. Let's turn on our human reference real quick. While we're here, let's line this up with the ground properly because I think I moved it. Looking at the shadows here, you can already see that the shadows that are cast by this human-sized reference object are far more in-depth or complex than the ones that I had in my original image that I painted. I just painted some simple ones, right? It's super basic. But the lighting is coming from two different directions, which means there'll actually be two different shadows that are overlapping each other, something like this. So the quality of shadows is far more accurate. And then the way that they occlude light, the way that they block light is going to be way more accurate than just painting it in. So how can we create an object that casts shadows, but it's not visible to the camera? So with any object, if you click on it, and let's turn on our visibility here again. If I click on this human object, and I click on this orange icon right here, this is the object properties of whatever you have selected, and I scroll down to visibility. Ray visibility. Every light that's going anywhere inside of 3D is a ray of light, right? We want everything to be visible except for any rays that are going to the camera. And if you hover over this, it says object visibility to camera rays. So let me just turn off this real quick. So the object's still selected. If I uncheck camera, all of a sudden the object is missing, but the shadows are still there. That's perfect. That means, let's just move this human's in position to maybe match the foot, the back left foot, or the camera left foot rather. I'm just gonna do this roughly. It doesn't have to be perfect right now. And I uncheck camera. Now you can see that it looks like this shadow is, or this foot is casting a shadow in 3D. That's what we want. But of course, the human reference doesn't, this 3D model doesn't match up with our subject at all. It doesn't match up in the pose or position, right? That's fine. We're actually not going to use this at all. I just wanted to demonstrate how you can go about creating something that has that effect. So I'm going to turn that off. I'm going to create a new collection, and we'll call this Shadow Casters, okay? And what we're going to do is we're going to keep this human size reference here for position references. And what I'm going to do is inside the Shadow Casters collection, I'm going to Shift A, or you can click on Add up here, Metaball, Ball. And it's going to create this huge, giant ball, right? Let's just scale this down a bit. Let's scale it down to like the size of a foot, maybe. Like a human foot, not a measurement. Something like that, okay? And it's just barely intersecting the ground. The cool thing about a meta ball, that's what I just created, is if I press Shift D and move it, they kind of melt together. So it's a nice quick way to get an organic object that is made up of multiple parts but looks to be all one singular piece. So as you might have guessed, what we're going to do is we're going to start at the feet, because that's where the most important or prominent shadows are going to be, are at the feet. I'm going to go back in my camera view. Let's just zoom in down here. And I'm going to hide the human reference. We don't need that anymore. I'm going to click on the meta ball. And I'm going to press G, Shift Z. And so now it moves around on the plane, but it stays at that height. And I'm just going to eyeball it to kind of match part of the foot. And in fact, what I'm going to do is actually, I'm going to duplicate this so it's more in the shape of a foot. Something like that. And you can scale a little bit if you want to. Okay, so these three objects are kind of foot-shaped. It doesn't have to be perfect, because all you're concerned about is the shadow. So again, G, Shift Z, and I'm just going to kind of move these around until it matches up with the foot. Now, before I get any further, with the meta ball selected, I'm going to uncheck camera visibility. And because all these meta balls kind of connect together with each other, you only have to turn off the ray visibility of the camera for one of those meta balls. If you're doing a different object, you'll have to do it for each one. But in this case, it's a meta ball, one meta ball. So let's move this back over. Let's move these three back over. And then just kind of move it around until it looks like the shadow of the foot is accurately casting shadows on the ground. And this process can be very flexible. So as long as you have the objects in relatively the same position as where the foot would be if this person existed in that scene, then you're going to get pretty decent shadows. So let's work on the next foot. So I'm going to copy these objects, Shift D to duplicate, then Shift Z to move like this. And I'm just going to move it back. So I'm going to rotate it so it kind of matches the orientation of that back foot. G, Shift Z, and then again, I'm just moving it around until I get something that looks accurate. And again, you don't have to be super precise about it, but you just want to make sure that that these objects kind of stay within the bounds of the foot or whatever object that is that you're casting a shadow for. So for example, this one on the left, if I move that over too far over, obviously that shadow doesn't make any sense because it's over here and the foot's over here. So just bring it over. And then another thing you want to make note of is anything that's intersecting the ground, make sure that's hidden behind the silhouette of the foot. So for example, if I have this one right here, as soon as I intersect the ground, I get like this hard black spot right here because the meta ball itself is actually it's actually going through the ground. So as you can see here, it's going through the ground. So because of that, there's a hard black spot here. But if that's hidden underneath the foot, then you won't see it. So just something to keep note of. Now, what you could do from here is you can just you can keep duplicating them to smooth out that silhouette a little bit. But we have contact shadows now for the ground, for the feet, but the shins and the legs should also be casting shadows on the ground too. So what you can do is you can click on one of those back meta balls, one of those back shadow casters, Shift D to duplicate, and just bring it up. Now let me get on my camera view so you can see what I'm doing, and I'll turn on the visibility so you can see what I'm doing as well. All I'm doing is moving this up. So I'm imagining this is where the ankle is. I'm going to scale it up a bit, Shift D, and just keep doing that to build the shape of the leg. And it doesn't have to be super exact, because most people won't notice what an inaccurate shadow will look like, as long as it just kind of roughly follows along with the shape loosely. So let's go ahead and do one over here too. Shift D, duplicate, scale, move. Shift D to duplicate, scale to move. And keep doing that a few times. Now what you might want to do is, because this character is standing in a stance that is varying in depth, it's not just perfectly straight onto the camera, you can get out of camera view and you can kind of fix the leg a bit. So you can see this is obviously the back leg and this is the front leg. Just move them over like that a bit. So just, like, as long as you like roughly connect it or roughly position it in the shape of like how a human would be, you'll be pretty good. And just get them to connect. Now obviously this looks horrendous, but if we go back into camera view, I'm gonna do one more for the torso also. Actually, let's scale this one up and duplicate one more for the torso. Oops. And go to camera view. And yeah, so again, I'll turn that off, click on the meta ball, the top one, and turn off the camera visibility. And so now all those, like, obviously they're positioned totally wacky ways, but it's close to the position of where the body is in 3D space, and you can double check it by looking at it from a different view. It's close enough. It doesn't have to be perfect. It's a little wonky, but what's important is not the position of the balls and what they look like that, but how the shadows look. So if I turn off the viewport of everything, you can see we have these really nice, complex, and accurate shadows on the ground here. And you just want to be extra careful and put the most attention on the parts of the shadow that are touching the ground. Because all these ones that are going up in the air like this, that are the shadow cast from the leg and thighs and the torso, those just need to be like kind of in the right area and kind of at the right scale. But now we have super accurate shadows that just work right out of the bat. We don't have to paint anything. We don't have to extract anything. They just work like that. And the cool thing about these shadows is, let's say we have a light here. Let's bring another light in. Let's make it like red or something. You can see here, because we have these shadow casters and we have this light here, this light is casting shadows itself, or it's filling in red on some of these shadows. Like this back foot has a little bit of red to it in this shadow right here. That would be very difficult to try and paint in. It is something to note that you shouldn't do the shadow casters until you have your lighting pretty much locked in, because if you start moving things around drastically in lighting, you might notice that the shadows that you made might look off and you'll have to readjust them. And that's fine, but that's just something to make note. So I'm going to go ahead, go back into this viewport to free up my computer resources and hit render image again. Okay, so it's finished rendering, and as you can see here, the shadows are in the image. They're looking great. So we're just going to go ahead and image, save as, find the folder that you want to save it to. I'm just going to call this background version 2. Make sure your format's correct, so PNG, RGBA, 16-bit, and hit save image. So we're just going to drag it right into Photoshop, hit enter to place it, and boom. Let's get rid of that shadow, and boom, just like that, we have our background image. We have contact shadows, the ground, that are accurate. They may not be like 100% exact to what they would be in real life, but they're close enough. They're close enough for what we're trying to do. They're accurate. They look good. When I'm looking at this, it feels to me like this foot is casting this shadow. And so that's all that matters. As long as it feels correct, then you're good. So at this point, we can decide, do we want to put a sky in the background? You know, we could put like an overcast sky or something. So let's try that. This is just a free stock footage website. And let's type in overcast and see what we got. Let's go with this one. Download that. Drag this image into Photoshop. And let's scale it up a bit. And let's put it behind our CG render. The cloud's looking good. Now, when it comes to adding clouds in, when it comes to adding anything in terms of photo bashing or compositing, putting images together, it's always good to still make note of that horizon line. So the horizon line right here of this image is about right here, and it's close. Well, not too much. I guess if I wanted to match the horizon line, it'd be probably something like that. But that's looking pretty good. It's matching. You know, like if I had the sky like way up here, right? The horizon line's way off. It looks totally wrong. If you can see like buildings or mountains and stuff like that, or trees, it's very important that you match that horizon line. But if it's just clouds, you know, clouds are ever changing and stuff, so you could probably be pretty flexible with it. So I'm just moving it around until it looks kind of good. I'm gonna make it a little bit bigger and place it. Now there are a couple things we need to do to match the sky. As you can see right now, right off the bat, it's too blue compared to everything else. The general lighting on my scene was like this kind of gunmetal bluish kind of a color, and this sky is way too green. So I'm gonna let's just name this sky. I'm gonna add an adjustment layer. Let's try a hue and saturation adjustment layer. Clip it to that. And let's just turn the saturation way down. And that's already looking pretty good. Let's actually turn the saturation up first. I want to match the hue a bit. So I think this is probably a little bit too green. So let's make this a little bit more blue, and now turn down the saturation. And yeah, that's looking pretty good. That's matching pretty well. At this point, when you have all of your elements together, you have your subject cut out, and you have your 3D image in, you got your shadows, whatever. At this point is what's known as the compositing phase. And the compositing phase is essentially just making sure that all of the elements are blended in together nicely and that they work in the same world together. And what I mean by that is, like, we don't want, for example, let me just mess this up. We don't want like the background or the 3D element that we made to have like super high contrast, right? Because our subject doesn't have super high contrast. Or the other way around, maybe our subject has super high contrast, but then all of a sudden our background doesn't, right? And I'm obviously overdoing this. It's way too high, way too crunched up, and looks bad, looks terrible. But you can see, if this was our original photograph, we would want our background image to match the same qualities that our original image has. So I would go and create another levels adjustment. And let's just pretend this first levels adjustment on the character is just part of the image. I'm going to create another levels adjustment, and I'm going to look at this and go, okay, cool. My main subject has super heavy contrast, super dark crushed blacks, and the whites are blown out. I want the rest of my image to have that too. So I'm going to bring in the levels. You can use curves or whatever adjustment layer you want. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to have super crunched white levels and black levels. And boom. All of a sudden, these two images are in the same world. They're together. Without this adjustment layer, it looks way off. You can tell this is punchier. It has more contrast, more saturation. The background's kind of flat and faded and not as saturated. So you want to match the worlds of those two images. And I mean, this is just a quick example. This is actually like very badly done. It looks, I've lost tons of details and whatnot, and it's overly done. But it explains the concepts of what I'm talking about. So you want to match the levels. That's what I just did. And you also want to match the colors. So let me get rid of this hue and saturation adjustment layer that I did for the sky and get rid of that. You can see here, the sky is far too saturated and green compared to the rest of the photo. Now that might be a stylistic choice that you might like. Maybe there's like this green magic in the air or something. I don't know, whatever. That might be a case. But in this case, I want a naturalistic looking sky that mirrors the lighting that I had on my CG, my computer generated background. I used the lighting on my 3D scene was made from what I imagined to be like a softer, overcast lighting, kind of muted blues and grays. So if I put a sky back there, as a viewer, I'm expecting the sky to be the main lighting source for my building. And when the sky looks like a different color than the building, and I'm talking about things that you know references for. So I know this is a gray concrete. So I know that the gray concrete will be similar in color to the lighting that it's in, which is the sky. When the sky doesn't match the lighting, or when the building doesn't match the lighting in the sky, or vice versa, I'll intuitively know just by looking at it that it's wrong. It might look cool, and I might be like, oh, this is a great image, but I'll still intuitively know it's wrong. And anyone who has a well-developed eye will look at it and be like, oh, you messed up, maybe. So by reducing the saturation and getting rid of some of those greens from the sky, all of a sudden, that image looks proper. It looks correct. So I've matched the colors, and I've matched the values of these images. They're all in one world. They're cohesive. But there's still more things. And keep in mind, these small adjustments that these adjustments that you're making can be on smaller scales and individually. So for example, I can have this levels adjustment just affecting the building, and then I might have another levels adjustment for the sky, and that might be differently because, you know, I rendered the sky out differently, or I got this from a photo, which isn't the same as the CG. So I might need to adjust this differently to match the other two elements. I need to bring down the contrast or the saturation a bit more now. Okay, great, cool. And then, okay, so, you know, I've matched the colors, right? I've matched the saturation. I've matched the levels, which is like the contrast ratios. How contrasty is it? How bright are the brights? How dark are the darks? I matched all those. But there's still something missing, right? There's one thing one glaring issue that I've overlooked. If I look at the sky by itself, the sky is fairly in focus, right? The sky, I mean, it's kind of hard to tell with the clouds, but it's in focus. You can see these mountains back here are pretty much in focus. But if you remember, my original image had depth of field. My background in CG, the 3D background, also has blurred out depth of field. So if I'm doing a third layer, a sky, that's behind my CG, and is further away, which it is, then I need to make sure that the background, the sky, is just as blurred or out of focus as these far back elements. So I'm going to turn off my subject for now real quick. For now, I'm going to move the sky up just so I can see the mountains. And I'm also going to turn off these levels adjustments because I don't want them. It was just an example. We will stylize the image and add some contrast, but not right now. Right now I'm looking at these buildings, and I'm comparing how blurred out they are to the background image of the sky. Or the other way around, I'm comparing how blurred out the sky is to the buildings. So I'm just going to click on the sky. I'm going to make it a smart object just so I can adjust it later if I need to, and go up to filter, blur, and I'm just going to do Gaussian blur for now. Now, a radius of 10 pixels, probably a little too much. Let's try 5. 5's looking good. Again, this is just going to come with time. Your eye will develop, or you'll develop an eye for things and you'll know. So I'm looking at the edges of this mountain back here, and I can see that the edges of that mountain is blurred at roughly the same amount as the edges of these buildings. So I think a blur of 5, maybe 7. Let's go with 7 because they're probably farther away. A blur of 7 pixels. That's looking good. Now I'm going to put that sky back where it was. Cool. Now there's another issue here, and this is another something that is important to establish. So you have your perspective, right? You have your lighting direction, you have your color matching, but you also want to match atmospheric perspective. So what is atmospheric perspective? Well, the atmosphere, the air, is filled with particles, dust, gases, light scattering, this and that. I'm not a scientist, but point is the further away things are, the more atmosphere there is between you and that object. And because of that, the more closer to the sky color that object will look. And so to demonstrate this, let's look at some pictures here of, let's just try some mountains. This will be a good example. Perfect. This is a good example. Okay. So these mountains in the middle here are further back than these mountains on the side. And you can see that these mountains in the back have this faded blue to it. That's the color of the sky. Not looking at the clouds, but the sky. Like imagine if there's no clouds in the sky at all. The atmosphere, that light blue during the day, that's the atmosphere. And that is invisible to us mostly, but it's actually visible on objects that are very far away. And that's why this has a slightly faded blue look. The farther away that is, the more closer to that sky color it's going to be. And the closer it is to the camera, the less affected by that sky color it's going to be. Well, here's another great example of atmospheric perspective. These mountains are super far away, and so they're closer in color to the sky because that blue that we see, that's atmosphere between the object, the mountain, and us, the viewer. These mountains and hills on the side are closer, so there's less atmosphere between you two, and so there's less of that shift in color. This is universal. And everywhere there's an environment with atmosphere, you're going to see atmospheric perspective. That's things that are farther away are going to be not necessarily brighter, but the dark point is going to be brighter. You can see here, these mountains that are super far away in the center of my screen almost aren't even visible because they have so much atmosphere between you and the mountains. They're almost the same color as the sky. So, one, that's an accurate thing that exists in real life. And two, it's also a really great way to establish depth and dynamics to your image. This CG render has no atmospheric perspective. Now, this building in the back might not be so far away where it would have a significant amount of atmospheric perspective, but we're doing art. We're not trying to recreate one-for-one reality. We're trying to create art. So we can enhance that a bit and make it a little bit more, enhanced. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new layer above my CG, and I'm going to make it a solid color. And let's just make it a light gray. I'm going to clip it to my CG. You do that by hovering between the two layers, the one on top that you want to clip to the one below, and hold Alt or Option on a Mac, and you'll get this little button. It just clips it. I think you could right click and do the same thing. Yeah, release clipping mask, create clipping mask. And then we're going to set this to maybe screen. Screen's not exactly accurate, but let's do it anyway. Then I'm going to click on the layer mask of this. Let's call this atmosphere perspective. We're going to click on the layer mask of atmospheric perspective and invert it so it's not visible. Now I'm going to press B to have my brush out. I'm going to make a big brush. I'm going to make sure I have white selected. And I'm going to have a very low flow. And I'm going to just paint kind of on this area back here. Make it even bigger. Now, if I look at the layer mask of this atmospheric perspective, you can see I just painted in white on the center of it. And I'm kind of centered on the objects that are farther away. Now, this is giving us the effect that we're looking for, but it's far too much. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the opacity of this layer and turn it all the way to 0. And I'm going to bring it back up again slightly, just a little bit at a time. until I get something that looks nicer. And then I think what I want to do is the same thing with the clouds in the back. I think these clouds are a little bit too dark too. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate the atmospheric perspective. Let's just get rid of the layer mask completely. Bring that down above our clouds. And because there's nothing else below it, we don't have to create a mask or anything. It's just there. And let's turn that opacity down all the way and just bring this up a bit. Just a tiny bit. 10, 15%. That's good. And so now you can see, and let's to enhance this, just so you can see what's going on, I'm going to create a black and white adjustment layer. And then I'm going to create a levels adjustment layer. And I'm just going to make a little bit more contrast in our scene. And you can see here that this building back here is slightly brighter, or has slightly more atmosphere than the buildings in the foreground. You can tell it's farther away, not just because it's small, but because it's lighter. And that intuitiveness is something that you want to put into your photographs or your art pieces. You want to have these small little things that are in real life present in your art. It can be enhanced, it can be exaggerated a bit, but you still want to have a sense of it, because all these small little things will add up to create an image that's believable, or at least it doesn't make someone look at it and go, huh, something's weird or off, right? It could be stylized, it could be enhanced, it could be different, but the principles are still there. So I'm going to delete these, and I'm going to turn my subject layer back on, and this is looking pretty decent. I'm liking the way this looks. Now, another thing to note, another thing when it comes to compositing, and this you can go very overboard with, but light wrap. So the light that is coming through this armhole here, or the light around the subject here, the light around the helmets, everything that's behind your subject, especially if it's bright, might bleed over a little bit. What I mean by that is, like, for example, let's make this brush a little bit smaller. I'm going to press, I'm just creating a new layer. Let's set it to, set it to screen. I'm going to sample part of the sky. And I'm just going to kind of paint a little bit over like that. A little bit of these areas. In fact, I'm going to go overboard with it, so you see what I'm doing. I'm sampling areas around the image. And what we could do is we could clip it to our subject layer again. Sample here, a little bit here. Now this is far too much. Far too much. But you can see what I'm doing. If I toggle it on and off, it helps blend in the elements. But it's far too strong, and there's too much of it. I would turn this down to like 0 first, and then just bring it back up a bit, maybe like 30%. It's always good to do things too much and then dial it down, because our eyes get used to seeing something, and so we tend to go overboard with it because our eyes get used to it. So usually what you do it until you like it, and you're going to know that that's probably too much. Bring it to 0 and then bring it back up slowly until you like it. And there are ways you can mathematically match stuff, but, you know, again, I'm here to have fun with art and not, like, go crazy from it, so I kind of just eyeball things. You know, if it's a super bright light source, maybe I'll create another layer, put it to screen. And if it's like a super bright area, and even some of the light that's on my subject itself, like this part of the helmet is super bright, so it might flare out a little bit. And the reason it's flaring is because light is entering the lens of the camera and bouncing around, and things that are really bright bounce around more and are more visible, so you'll get that flaring. Yeah, actually, let's let's delete that. I'm going to undo the clip mask for this one, because this one I want it to be visible everywhere, not just within the subject. And so I'm just sampling these areas of my subject that are really bright, that would be scattering light a little bit. Do the same back here. A little bit on this leg. Maybe a little bit of this red is bleeding over. These are all very subtle adjustments. And it's always good to have elements like this that overlap both the original photo and the CG, the computer graphic photo, the 3D image. Because then it kind of ties things together. If there's a glare or a flare of light that's over both the original image and the CG, then it's more believable that those elements belong together and that they're not cut and pasted onto each other. So when you're looking at this, again, it's always good to check how things are looking. So wait, first off, I'm going to, let's call this light wrap 1, not 12, but 1. And again, this goes back to keeping things organized. Light wrap 2. And let's delete our old shadow that we made. We don't need that anymore. Yeah, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna create a black and white adjustment layer. And what I'm looking here for is things that the levels are properly set. And I kind of showed this earlier when I'm talking about contrast levels. If the contrasts of my subject is far less, it's going to look off. So you can see here, the subject is super light. There's no dark spots on it. The darkest parts of him are right here. Aren't as dark as the darkest parts of this right here. And so we want to make sure that that's not the case. And you're thinking in depth. You're not matching the colors of him or your subject to what's behind, because what's behind might be really far away, or it might be in different lighting conditions. You want to match your subject, or match your background to your subject on, think of it as planes: foreground, midground, background. Think of it in that. So my character right here is kind of in the foreground of this image. Maybe not extreme foreground, but it's not quite midground and it's not quite background. A little bit of the foreground. So I'm looking at that part of my CG to match the levels to. So if I get rid of that, I can see here that like the dark parts of this, the darkest parts of my subject here in the shadow, are pretty close to the darkest parts here. They match. They're not too off. Same with the brightest parts too. Although that might not always be visible. For example, the brightest parts of this image are like the top of the hand and the side of the helmet. But maybe there's nothing on the background that's receiving that same light. But I think it actually could use a little bit more contrast. So I'm going to create, above my CG, I'm going to create a levels adjustment. And I'm going to just increase the brights a little bit. And because I increased the brights a little bit, I might want to decrease the darks a little bit too. I'm just adding a little bit more contrast, basically. Just a tiny bit. But I don't want it to add it everywhere. See, if I turn this off and on, it's adding it everywhere, even the background. I want to add this extra punch of contrast only in the areas near my subject. So I'm going to click on this contrast punch. I'm going to click on this layer mask, invert it so it's not visible anywhere, and get a big soft round brush and just paint that in this area. I'm going to turn up the flow a little bit higher and just paint this in around this area, around my subject. Maybe a little bit on the windows right here. And boom, if I toggle that on and off, it's only visible in the foreground. You can see here's a layer mask for it. It's only visible in the foreground. And now it just kind of adds. It just kind of meshes a little bit better. You know, it's not as flat. You can see without that adjustment layer, it's kind of flat right here and on the sides. And then with it, it's just a little bit punchier. Kind of matches the punchiness of the subject. And this is good stuff to do with the black and white adjustment layer, because that way your eyes aren't focused on colors, but rather they're focused on the values. So now I can delete that black and white adjustment layer and continue on. I could do the same thing with saturation too. I can click on an adjustment layer and add a hue and saturation, and I'm just going to crank the saturation way up. And you can see here the saturation of everything in the image, but exaggerated. Now, watch this. Let me turn this back off real quick. And let's look at the hue and saturation adjustment layer of my sky. I'm going to turn that off, right? Now it's more green, a little bit more greenish, more saturated. Now, looking at it like this, you might not notice that. Let's just say you don't. But once you add that hue and saturation adjustment layer, now things are far more noticeable. You can see the color of the sky is a little bit more green than the color of the concrete. And the concrete's usually gray, so it shouldn't have far much different of a color. The brightness might be different because it could be dark concrete, right? And a bright sky, but the color we're looking at, the hue, this is a little bit more green than blue. And if I add that hue and saturation correction that I made earlier, if I turn that back on, all of a sudden that sky matches a little bit better. The same thing with like the reds. Although the reds don't matter too much, the red is just stylized lighting in the back. But it will be nice to have a little bit of consistency in red colors, and the reds on that kind of look like the reds on the rest of my image. So I'm happy. I'm going to delete that. I'm happy with the values of my image, and I'm happy with the colors of my image. So far, everything has matched, more or less. You can spend a lot more time on this, and I'll go over more techniques later in different videos on how to match things a little bit better. But just based off those adjustments alone, I'm pretty satisfied with the integration of my CG elements and my photographed subject. But that doesn't mean I'm done. There's a couple more things that I can do, or that you should do. So this, up to this point, all these compositing steps of matching values and fixing lighting, colors, and whatnot, are to get things to match. Once everything's matched, you can start treating this as if it's a photo that you took. And what would you do if you took a photo of this in real life? Well, you would bring it into like Lightroom or Photoshop and you'd start editing it, right? You'd start adding your style to it. You'd start messing with contrast and colors and moving things around and adding glow and whatnot and smoke. You don't want to use like smokes and glows and stuff like that and explosions and magic to cover up your mistakes. You want to have a solid foundation before you start adding cool visual effects and whatnot. Things like gunshots and blood splatters and lightning bolts and explosion. Yeah, all that stuff is not corrective. That's additive. To correct your image, you need to do these small, boring adjustments that I've been showing you so far. Now that we have something that's a little bit more, and in fact, now I'm looking at this and I think there's just a little bit too much glow haze on his stomach, and I think that's coming from, yeah, it's coming from this first light wrap. You can see here around the stomach. It's just too much. So I'm going to add a layer mask to that first light wrap, and I'm just going to use black with a big soft round brush and just kind of paint away some of that. I don't need all that. All right, that's looking good. Okay, so at this point, we're not going to add any smokes or crazy glows or anything like that. We're going to keep it a fairly simple image for now. But I will show you the steps that I take to finish it off for my compositing. So what I first am going to do is I want to try and replicate. Well, here, first what I'm going to do is I'm going to merge all visible layers into one layer on top. So I'm going to make sure I have the top most layer selected. And in Photoshop, I'm going to press Control, Shift, Alt, and E. And you can see that just basically it merged everything into one layer on top. If you're using a different program, I'm not sure how you can do that. Maybe you can just duplicate all the layers and merge them into one. There might be an option how to do it. But or, I mean, if you really need to, you could just save out the image and then edit that image. But I'm going to do everything inside of Photoshop. So I now have, if I turn off everything, I just have this, I have one single image here. I want to try and do a little bit more, I take it back, I'm not finished with the compositing. I actually want to create a little bit more imperfections to my CG that wasn't present in my original photograph. So if you look at original photographs, the edges of stuff, well, this might actually be a bad example, but generally around the edges of photographs, you're going to have a little bit of softness. Things are going to be sharper in the center of your photo than the edges around. So what I'm going to do is, it's a fun little trick that I did is, so let's click on that top layer that's merged. We'll just call this merged. I'm going to duplicate that. Control J to duplicate. We're going to call this edge blur. Sure. What I'm going to do is I'm going to get a radial marquee tool and then just select around like that, something like that. And then I'm going to go up to filter, or no, I'm going to go up to select, modify, and feather. I'm going to feather my selection by about, 300 pixels. And then I'm going to Control-Shift-I to invert that selection. So now I have an inverted feathered selection of the center. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up to filter, blur, radial blur. And I'm going to set this to zoom, or I mean, you could try spin, but I'm going to do zoom, and I'm just going to set it to 1 for the value, and hit OK. And then turn off my selection, and nothing might be visible just yet, but if I go up to the edges here, if I toggle this on and off, let's find something with a little bit more detail. You can see the edges here are just slightly blurred out. And it's not like a normal blur, it's a kind of a smeared blur. It's a super, super subtle effect. But it's just one more thing that you can do to add a little bit of, you can really notice it on this piece of trash right here. If I turn this off and then back on, it just adds a little bit of that edge imperfection that's noticeable in a real life image. And then one more thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this image one more time. I'm going to call this chromatic aberration. I spell it wrong every time, and most lenses have a little bit of chromatic aberration, at least. And basically that's just like a little bit of shifting of colors on the edges of things. So to do this, I'm going to create a new layer, right? Duplicate a layer of everything. And in Photoshop, if you double click on that layer, it'll bring up this layer styles panel. And what you could do is you could turn off, under the blending options, you can turn off individual channels. I'm just going to turn off the red one for starters. No specific reason. I just clicked on that and turned off the red channel. You won't notice anything. There's going to be no difference. But if I move this layer, all of a sudden, you get chromatic or you get this color split tone. People might do this for like 3D effects and stuff, right? But if you just offset that a couple pixels, so just like press left and right on the arrow keys a couple times, you're gonna have chromatic aberration. So again, it's not a super visible effect, but you can definitely see it. So if I turn this off and on, off and on, and look on these edges right here, wherever there's a clear defined edge, off and on, you get this little green here and orange here. It's called chromatic aberration. It's kind of redundant to do it on top of the subject. You can definitely see the effect of it here. If this is off and this is on, you can see the edges of the hand, how it's kind of got a little bit of orange red here and a little bit of green here. But by having this effect on top of him and on top of the CG, it's another trick that you can do to kind of blend the elements together. Now this is too much, so I'm going to go back 1 pixel, and I just want to, it's a super, super subtle effect, but it's just like a 1 pixel difference between these two layers that that just helps kind of bring things together. Now, one more time, Control Shift Alt and E. I'm going to duplicate everything together, and I'm going to call this toning. And I'm going to bring this into, I like to do my color toning in Camera Raw, which is basically like Lightroom inside of Photoshop. But here, since I have all of my elements tied together, everything is looking good, I can do some stylized editing to this. So first and foremost, another powerful thing you can do, if you notice my image, well, I denoised my image, my original subject, but there is still a little bit of grain. There's still a little bit of grain in my subject. But, excuse me. So if you notice, there's still a little bit of grain in my subject, right? But my CG has 0 grain because it was denoised and it's CG. It's perfect, right? So I could actually add in a little bit of grain. Same with the sky. The sky was blurred out, so that blurred out any of the natural grain from that photo. So I'll just go to something like the effects and add grain. I'll bring it up to max first, all the way. And that's obviously way too much. But you can see how it blends things together. The grain on the subject matches the grain on the background. But again, that's far too much. So I turn the grain up to max strength first, and I just get the size how I want it to be. The size and roughness. I'll just turn the size down a little bit, the roughness up a little bit. Then I'll turn the grain back down to 0. Let's just turn up to something like maybe, let's just say 20. Yeah, 20 is good. So 18 to 20-ish. And so if I toggle that off and on, it might not be visible on YouTube, but there is a definite difference. If I have it on, it's not enough grain to make the image look super grainy. You just want to add enough grain to where the grain that's visible on the elements of the 3D, the background, sky, and the subject are all there. The grain on all 3 of these elements, the sky, the person, the CG, all have the same grain on it. And because of that, we accept this as being one cohesive image. We accept that these are together. They're not cut and pasted onto each other. We accept that they are one and the same. Now, you could add more grain if that's your style. You know, some people like a super filmic, grainy look. And if that's what you want, go for it. But you can add grain as a compositing tool. Just adding a slight amount, anywhere from like 10 to 15% grain is enough to give it that cohesive look. Now from here, I'm just playing around with things. I'm, playing around with the contrast, exposure, this part is not something that you should be copying me or really following me on. This is literally just a purely stylized approach to things. Play around with the color balance, the vibrance, saturation. I'll go to my curves and maybe I'll just bring up the black point a little bit. And again, this is all to personal taste. This is stuff that you'll develop as you grow as an artist or as you develop. It'll change over time. Your styles will change. Your tastes will change. But this step right here is purely your own style. It's not something that you necessarily need to copy unless you're trying to learn. It's good to copy someone if you're trying to learn, but then eventually take what you learn and adapt it towards your own style. But yeah, I'm basically just one at a time. I'm going down these sliders and I'm just moving it left and right and seeing what works. If I like it in one direction than the other, I'll put it in that direction. If I don't like it, I'll put it in the other direction. If I don't like either direction, I'll just leave it where it's at. And I'm just doing this for everything. The toning, I'm playing around with it, see what looks cool. If I like it, if I don't like it, it's pretty much pure experimentation at this point. But there is no... With the previous steps that I've been showing you, they are a little bit more of like correct and not correct in terms of like matching levels and whatnot, matching grain. Those are a little bit more like, I don't want to say concrete because everything is artistic expression, but there is a more solidified guideline when it comes to approaching that stuff. But what I'm doing here is just, it's toning, it's color grading. I'm just doing what I like. I'm just doing what I think fits the taste for an individual photo, if that makes any sense. And so right here I'm just, doing some color toning. Just like I said before, I put everything stronger than it needs to be. I find like what I like find a color that's like, oh, I like this color, I like that color, but it's too much. I'll just bring it down. Same with the highlights. And color toning is another way to add cohesiveness. You definitely, one, it is stylized and it is to taste, but it also helps bring everything together. For example, I'm introducing a little bit of magenta into the shadows and a little bit of green into the highlights using this color grading slider right here. And because of that, it's adding that toning onto all of the elements. The sky, the CG, my subject. We'll add some sharpening to this. I like really sharp images, so I'm going to do a pretty good amount of sharpening. Yeah. I'm going to hit OK on that one. And boom, you can see the before and after with my toning. Huge difference. This feels more like a kind of a straight out of camera, unedited look, and then this one has a far more stylized look to it. And then at this point, you're pretty much done. And if you want to like play around with it a little bit more, what you could try, and what I like to do a lot of times, is I'll go to an adjustment layer and add a color lookup adjustment layer. And these are called LUTs. This list of LUTs are just ones I've downloaded from the internet that are free or paid for. And yeah, just look up LUTs if you want to, LUT packs, and you can install them into Photoshop. Just look up how to add LUTs into Photoshop. Or maybe I'll create a video on that later. And what I'll do is I'll create that LUT or lookup adjustment table adjustment layer. And then I'll just click on this first one right here. And then I'll just use the arrow keys and just cycle through and see if there's any happy accidents. See if there's anything that like drastically looks different that I like. And 9 times out of 10, there will be something that I really, really like. Yeah, like the toning on this one. I love the toning on this. This looks so cool to me. But it's too much. And just like with everything else, you start at 100%, take it down to 0, and then bring it back up until you like it. So at this one, I'm thinking like 40%. It's looking cool. Now, I do like the colors, but it got a little too dark for me. So, but before this color lookup adjustment table, I'm going to add another levels. And I'm just gonna bring up the brightness a little bit more. Just a little bit. Yeah, that's looking cool. Yeah, guys. So that is essentially my process from start to finish when creating an image. Now, of course, when it comes to adding visual effects, lighting, explosions, fire, this and that, there's a lot more to it. And especially if you're creating those effects in 3D, like you're creating explosions and you're creating debris blasts and crumbling buildings, there's a whole lot of techniques, and I plan on going over in depth. The same way I did this, I plan on going in depth on those videos, or on those techniques and processes and whatnot. But I think this is a good starting point. I think this is a good video that a lot of you have been asking me for. A lot of you have been asking me to go slower, go more in depth, and create something that's a little bit more all-encompassing and not so much a time lapse. So you guys just walked through with me this whole image from start to finish. I didn't gloss over anything. Everything that I did, you guys saw me do. And if you have any questions, let me know. If there's something else you want to see, let me know. And if you want to see more of videos like this, more in-depth, unstructured, just walkthroughs where I just talk, and go through everything, let me know. And that's about it. So I hope you liked the video, and I'll see you in the next one.